Good afternoon, everybody. It's with pleasure that the Indian Institute of Public Administration, the Karnataka Regional Branch, Bengaluru, and the IAS Officers Association, Karnataka.
You have to use the mic.
Hello.
Some other mic.
It's audible.
Audible.
It's audible. It's audible.
At the back.
I hope I'm audible at the back, please.
So not audible.
Hello?
Use the other mic.
Hello.
And mic. And mic.
Yeah. Okay. Today we have a special lecture followed by a panel discussion by Professor Karthik Muralidharan. Professor Karthik Muralidharan is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. His research spans public finance and development economics with a focus on improving education, health, welfare, and public service delivery. Professor Karthik, if you have seen some of the YouTube videos, is a brilliant speaker. He's able to engage the audience and reach to the nub of the issue. He's able to tell you what it is. In fact, I was talking to TK Anil Kumar Saab and a couple of people who read the book. Many of us who are practitioners actually have found he's verbalizing our intuitive sentiments. He's able to actually put it because of his sheer experience in the field, which is based on both his academic interest as well as practical experience. So, Professor Karthik, very warm welcome to you today. I also welcome our distinguished chairman of the Indian Institute of Public Administration, Karnataka branch, our ex-chief secretary, Shri Vijay Bhaskar sir. Very warm welcome to you. I welcome all the senior serving officers, retired officers, various dignitaries from various educational institutions, from CEGIS, from the Department of Economics and Statistics, the Fiscal Policy Institute, the government and other parastatal bodies who are attending today's lecture and panel discussion. The methodology will be like this. First, we will have Professor Karthik discussing on his book and his experience for the next 45 minutes, followed by a short panel discussion by each of the speakers who are here today for about 3 to 5 minutes each, followed by a Q&A. So without further ado, I request Professor Karthik to take over.
Can you hear me at the back? All good. And this. Use this mic. Okay. This is better? I see. Okay. All right. So, I'm incredibly excited to give this talk today because, I've been giving talks around the country, but I am so tired of listening to myself, that I really am excited about listening to the discussions, from the distinguished, guests here today, particularly the practitioners who've been, in the bowels of the state. I'm also especially pleased to be here that, my first series of public events is in Bangalore. As you notice from the cover of the book, you'll notice that Karnataka Vidhana Saudha gets like pride of place, right? On the cover of the book. And it is, the book is called A State-Led Roadmap for Effective Governance. And you'll see, because partly one of the points is that 90% of what affects the lives of citizens, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's public safety, whether it's district court, whether it's land laws, labor laws, all of these are with the state governments. But most of our public discourse in terms of policy for India happens at the national level. So, and states in India are bigger than most countries, and we really need to kind of activate deep state level thinking, state level action, right? We need to drive the country forward. So the theme of the cover, you'll notice, has 4 different kind of assemblies. There's Karnataka, Maharashtra, UP, and Rajasthan. But the other reason Karnataka gets pride of place is I really am a bit of an old-fashioned idealist, okay? And so the first time I came and saw that building, that carving of government work is God's work, kind of had such a deep impression on me. That was kind of, the moment I was like, this has to be on the cover. And then the only thing was kind of to do this in a way that it's not in your face, but for people who know, if you look at it, you will see it very clearly. If you squint, that print, will be very, very clear. So, so I'm especially grateful to be here doing this, talk in Karnataka. So what I'm going to do is, since there's also obviously many attendees who are not from the government, I'm going to just give you a big picture overview of the book, of the core arguments, and then really look forward to the discussions by the serving officers who are kind of, leading the departments or have led the departments that many of the specific chapters are focused on. So by the way, if this works, does this work? No, you prefer this. Okay. So then maybe that's an advantage because I can pace a little bit. Like, I don't have to. Does it affect the video? Okay, I do have to stay in place for the video. Is that right? Sorry. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so I think, see, before we dive into kind of the details of the talk, if you take a step back and look at where India itself is, okay, now there's a lot to be proud of, right? As we think about 75 years of India, I started writing the book hoping to come out in 2022 for 75th year of independence. But the book started as a 3-year project, ended up taking close to 5 years because of the sheer size. But the good news is it is the 75th year as a sovereign republic. So that 75 years still works. Okay. So, but as you take stock of India at 75, there's a lot to be proud of, okay, right? We are kind of in the global landscape. The Indian democracy, Indian political unity, Indian diversity is a miracle, okay, is a true miracle that humanity has actually never seen. Okay, we are one of the largest growing, fastest growing large economies. We have macro stability. We have science going for us, demographics going for us, and as well as as well as a diaspora. So there's a lot to be proud of, okay? But at the same time, we also face massive challenges that affect both the quality of life of our individual citizens as well as our collective performance as a country. And most of these have to do with kind of the delivery of basic public services, okay? So in education, we have 50% of children complete primary school without being able to read at a second grade level, okay? And for those of you in education, you kind of, there's a saying that you have to learn to read in primary school so that you can then read to learn, okay? So if you haven't learned to read by class 5, most of your education is effectively over, okay? And as I'll show you with like a couple of powerful pictures, health and nutrition, we've got 35% of children are stunted. And that is 2 standard deviations below, right? Meaning what the global benchmarks are. And this is obviously very, very strongly correlated with lower lifetime human capital and development. The police are chronically understaffed, under-equipped, under-trained, and overworked. The courts have a backlog of over 30 million cases. And again, each of these are issues which I'll talk about that not only affect individual welfare, but also affect economic growth. Our welfare systems are, they exist, but they are weak, as we saw during COVID. And, regardless of where you are, we've got this massive crisis of jobs. Okay, so how are we going to make progress? So when you look at this, in general, the narratives in India tend to be very bipolar. Okay, so you've got one narrative that says, we are great. This is guaranteed to be India's century. Our time has arrived. So great things are happening. On the other side, you have kind of people writing books like India is broken. Okay, saying that everything is dysfunctional. Okay, so as is usual in India, when you have 1.4 billion people, you can tell whatever story you want by where in the distribution you are sampling. Okay, so and the truth is we are a solid B plus. Okay, as I'll show you in the data. And there's a lot to be proud of. But like any good professor, my grade for India is can do better. Okay, so like it is. So how can we do better while both appreciating the positives and saying here are kind of ways in which we need to work. Okay, and that's kind of the spirit of the entire book is one of kind of eyes open, data driven, realistic optimism, but that doesn't sugarcoat the challenges that we face. Okay, now. One way to think about the overall India story, right, from an economics perspective, is that we've got a top 10% of the income distribution that is able to drive economic growth through a combination of creating firms and having kind of, access to high-paying jobs. You have another 30 to 40% who are in service sector jobs of various quality that are serving the demand created by that top 10%. And then you have a bottom 50 to 60% that's basically left out of the India story, primarily in rural areas, okay? And these are then the folks who are primarily dependent on government welfare programs, and that welfare system is what kind of maintains sustenance, but also allows them to participate in the process of growth. So the overall political story of India, there's a reason why every election campaign is primarily fought on welfare schemes, because that's where the voting numbers are, and that's what allows the poor to participate in kind of the prospects of growth. Okay, now at one level, this is kind of a reasonably well-working model, because we have been getting 6.5% growth rates. And that's because 10% of India is still 140 million people. That's a lot of people, enough to kind of have some of the world's leading talent, have startups, have global capability centers, and really be world-beating in a lot of areas. Okay, so when you look at the Bangalore airport, when you look at the MNCs, when you look at the investments, when you look at the startups, it's easy to kind of, say we are doing great, right? And that's because this is a large population, and that's quite real. Okay, but to get to full potential, you can't get to full potential without firing on all engines. Okay, so and that basically means that this 50% of the population has to be empowered to move from being passive recipients of government welfare to being active contributors to the kind of personal and national growth story. Okay, and so how are we going to achieve that? To that, the single biggest challenge is weak human development. Okay, like I said, you in a modern skill-driven economy, right? If you've got this level of challenge in basic education, basic nutrition, police and public safety, backlog in cases, so it really is constrained by weak state effectiveness in delivering essential public goods and services, right? Including rule of law and environmental quality. So, and if you look at the endorsements of the book, both Dr. Monte Kaluwalia and Dr. K.P. Krishnan, who's from the state, they've observed that, the 91 reforms was all about getting the government out of the way, okay, in terms of making it not do the things it was doing. But it needed the second set, which is investing in what the government should be doing and but that's a much harder project, right? Because it's easier to stop doing something than it is to build systems to allow us to get something done. And so, this is not just my view. Here is kind of Rakesh Mohan, who's one of the architects of the 91 reforms. When he wrote his review of 25 years of reforms, this is him basically saying the way forward for accelerated growth in India is being held back by major governance deficits in all areas connected with the delivery of public goods and services. Okay, so this is even at a growth level. And the reason I tell the story this way, okay, I could also tell the story from the perspective of human rights and justice and welfare, and partly because essentially, like it or not, the decision makers in this country tend to be elites, and elites have seceded from being recipients of public services. Okay, so part of building kind of the broad national consensus for why this is our top priority is to kind of also get the elites of the country to understand that this is where we need to act. You can't just kind of cocoon yourself in your gated communities, right? That the broader agenda of governance is something that we all have a collective stake in. Okay, so the analogy I use, is sometimes like the elites and middle classes are like the first and business class passengers, right? But if you look at the time of COVID, if the plane is crashing, it's taking everybody down. Okay, so we all have a stake in this, and building effective public systems is going to be key to getting to full potential. And like Pritchett was always a bit more provocative. Okay, this is Pritchett saying the weak performance of the Indian state is one of the 10 greatest challenges facing humanity, okay, of the order of climate change. And that's partly because of the scale of the problem and the number of people affected. Okay, so, and part of the reason for writing this book is as we assess India at 75, there's perhaps no greater barrier to achieving full potential for citizens than improving the effectiveness of the Indian state. Okay, now, normally, when kind of the public discourse happens on, we need to improve health, improve education, the default is always to say we need to increase the budget. Okay, so everybody is just kind of looking for more budget, okay, as a way of solving their problem. Now, the reason for writing this book is that really one of the most important patterns of results of 20 years of work is that it is not about increasing spending in the government as usual way. Okay? So there's two limitations with this. One, we don't have the money. So most of the time, when education wallas want 6% of GDP, health wallas want 3% of GDP. Now, these norms, they partly come from OECD countries that have a tax to GDP ratio of 35%. We are sitting at half of that tax to GDP ratio. So if you look at our sectoral allocations, now health is low, okay? But if you look at our sectoral allocations relative to GDP and tax to GDP, we're not doing so bad. Okay, so which means this So it's almost like they're stuck in a low-level equilibrium when every department asks for more money. Finance doesn't have the money, and then they'll say you won't get the money, and then that lack of money is then used as an alibi for not delivering. Okay? Because you're not applying your mind to kind of this core issue of cost effectiveness and how do you deliver better. Okay, so that is kind of the first point. A, we don't have the money. Second is what a lot of the evidence shows is that the translation of government spending in a business as usual way into outcomes is very, very, very poor. Okay, so one of the most important reasons for writing this book is over 20 years of my research, the common pattern. See, I started most of my work in education. Then over the years, I worked on welfare, on child development, on health. And one amazingly common pattern across all of these studies is that the social rate of return on investment to investing in governance and state effectiveness is often 10 times higher than simply spending more in a government as usual way. So in fact, it's I think Mukprit Bhatia, who's I think Jharkhand Cadre. So he read a draft and he's the person who suggested that I replace business as usual with government as usual. Okay, so and which is I think a better characterization of what happens. Okay, and the truth is that so let's just look at these studies. And each of these studies, and just for the academic, minded people in the audience, each of those papers represents maybe 8 to 10 years of work, okay, of deep data collection, of kind of randomized evaluations, measurement of outcomes, tracking fund flows from dispersal all the way to the field, understanding where it gets kind of held up, and being peer reviewed and published in some of the leading journals in the world. Okay, so for example, in education, where does most of our money go? Most of it goes for unconditional pay commission increases. Okay, but what the research shows is that there is absolutely zero relation between unconditional pay increase and effectiveness. Okay, so most of the money goes, and as anybody in finance knows, 50% of our budgets in most states and central goes to interest, pensions, and salaries, right? And the unconditional increases have very little impact. Whereas even very modest amounts of performance-linked pay, even if it's 3% or 5%, if there is something that is linked to performance, ends up being way more effective than your business as usual. And then in the case of welfare, we had this study on biometric smart cards, where in Andhra Pradesh, large-scale randomized evaluation across 20 million people. And what we saw is, again, that the reduction in leakage was about 10 times higher than the cost of implementing that biometric program. And amazingly, when we looked at the impacts of improving NREGA on the overall poverty rates, the effect of improving implementation was bigger than rolling out the program itself. Okay, so much of our public discourse focuses on the program design, but implementation is seen as a boring thing that, because where is our public discourse? Public discourse is we need to do this program, we need to raise the budgets, we need to allocate the money, and then everybody loses interest, okay, in terms of looking at the translation from the top line of expenditure to the bottom line of impact, okay? So, and that's what's incredible, that the overall poverty impact was bigger from improving implementation, okay, than from rolling out the program itself. Another, there's a whole bunch of other studies. So there's a recent one, again, in the JPE, in the ICDS in Tamil Nadu, where again, large-scale randomized control trial. So, what I'm doing in this book is, at one level, I'm a child of kind of the empirical revolution in economics that uses a combination of randomized evaluations plus kind of independent measurement of outcomes. But now what I'm doing is, each of those studies might seem very narrow, but I'm bringing it together in a much broader framework of making sense of the Indian state itself, okay? So what happened in that study? We found that just putting an extra half-time worker in the ICDS, okay, just 50% time, focused on preschool education, led to a substantial improvement in learning outcomes and a significant reduction in stunting and malnutrition, because you were increasing the time available for the existing worker to work on nutrition. Okay, and the key thing with personnel, which I'll talk about, is that the key is, at one level we're understaffed, at another level those who have are not accountable enough. Okay, so but here these are locally hired staff, and that's what kind of keeps the accountability high. And we estimate that the rate of return on this investment is 12 to 20 times the cost. Okay, so this is based on global estimates of the long-term wage returns to improving early childhood learning. Whereas we are kind of, if any private investor was told that you're getting a 2000% ROI or 2000%, he said, how can I put more money on this? Okay, but we've not been doing this. And where does the money go? The money goes in unconditional pay increases, okay, which again have zero impact. And then one of my favorite recent studies, and then this is the farmer welfare study in Telangana. Again, so simple. So Raitu Bandhu, high profile program. all that we did was we had an outbound call center that made 25,000 calls to farmers over a 2-week period, measured directly by talking to the recipients. Have you gotten the program? And then we randomized at the Mandal agricultural officer level, telling them you are being measured this way. Okay. And so for the lower level official to know that you have visibility on performance led to a significant improvement in on-time payments. And we estimate again the ROI was 25 to 100 times the cost of kind of doing this. So if you're a policymaker, if you want to get more benefits to people, the default is say increase the budget, right? But you invest in the plumbing, you're going to get a much higher ROI. Okay. And the most recent study, and this is really stunning. So this is, a PhD student from Berkeley who's now a professor at the University of Delaware. She's from Bangalore, Manasuni Rao. And, she's got this beautiful paper looking at district court judge vacancies, okay, and looking at how when people get transferred in, that every extra district court judge manages to clear another 200 cases a year. But because 60 to 70% of the cases are land and credit, okay, so these are the two key factors of production that are being tied up when they are under dispute and not being used. And so she estimates that the total increase in economic activity that happens from that extra judge is about 30 times the total cost of that judge. And the tax increase alone will be 5x. Okay, so, but that is the kind of low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, that we are leaving behind by kind of not investing in the state itself. So this is kind of why I felt that there is now enough evidence across sectors over these years to put this all together and kind of shine the light on the need to deeply invest, okay, in kind of the machinery and the inner plumbing of the Indian state. Okay, so the reason the book, I mean, it is this kind of looks like a scary 18-chapter Mahabharata, okay, which of course Mahabharata does have 18 chapters, but it is because it's a complex subject, okay, it's a complex subject, but every chapter is written in a very accessible way. Now, the core of the book is the middle two parts, right, which is essentially building an effective state, and partly because I believe that that is the essential prerequisite for accelerating India's development. Okay, so the first half is kind of the conceptual part, the second half is the policy part. But before we get into that, I think it's useful to take a step back and look at the incentives and constraints of the two key actors of the state, right, who are the politicians and the bureaucrats. And these are the two chapters which I had to do the most work on, right, because it's outside my normal area, but it's also the chapters which I think for the readers, it gives you a sense that, okay, this is not just an ivory tower academic, okay, that there is some real awareness of what the internal constraints are, okay. So what I want to do is just take a 5-minute historical kind of overview. And when you understand this politician's predicament, okay. And so when I say state capacity, right, the whole point of the book is that we need to invest in building state capacity to deliver better, okay. But what do we mean? Because it's not so obvious how to think about state capacity. Because at one level, the Indian government does an amazing job whenever you function in mission mode. Okay. So we run the world's largest elections. We run the world's biggest vaccination campaigns. If you look at the logistics of the Kumbh Mela, there's no other place in the world that manages things like that. Our disaster relief operations, I think would put people in the West to shame. Okay. So what they struggled with Katrina, in India, we would have a process in 4 hours that's able to respond to these disaster reliefs. Okay. And I think so the point is that we do have a lot of capacity, right? But the reason we can execute in mission mode is because it is time bound and there is political and media salience, and the entire resources of the state or a large fraction of the resources of the state are deployed to solving that problem. Okay. But where we fail is when it comes to the day-to-day ongoing delivery of regular services that are important but never urgent. Okay. So that is where we kind of are found wanting. And that requires better systems, right? Because the whole point of building better systems is that things happen automatically, even without external pressure focused on that particular thing. Okay. So what I want to do is, why are we like this? Okay. And before we beat down on ourselves, it's useful to take this historical view and understand that there are 2 ways to think about state capacity. There is what, again, is a framework from Francis Fukuyama, that there is the scope of the state, okay, which is what does the state try to do, and that is determined by the political process. And then there is the strength of the state, which is your ability to deliver against that scope. Now, what's happened is over time, the scope of the state keeps increasing, okay? And one way to see this is that historically, the modern state has gone through 3 major waves, okay? So For most of human history, for 3,000 years, the nation state was essentially just a security state. So the main thing that governments focused on was defense and law and order. Okay, and one way to see that is even in the 18th century, about 80% of budgets in Europe, 80% of national budgets were going to defense, okay, and law and order, because the existential threat was war, right? And that was the main thing the state did. Okay, now it is only in the 19th century at the time, and again, it's not like the roads were not built, but the roads were primarily built for mobilizing troops and moving them to the border. Okay, so there may have been some collateral economic benefit from, say, the Grand Trunk Road and stuff like that, but the primary reason was military. Okay, and any economic benefit was secondary. Okay, now it's only in the 19th century, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, that you get into the second wave of the modern nation state, okay, where governments start saying, okay, we can use taxpayer money to start building major infrastructure, roads, railroads, ports, water sanitation, and some mass education, okay? And it's not an accident that this happens at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so why is that? Because Industrial Revolution is when you get massive economies of scale in production. So till then, production is decentralized. But when I have massively concentrated production, then I need transport and storage. Okay, but the returns, the productivity increase from the Industrial Revolution is 40x. So it's so large that it makes sense to make these investments. And this is the period in time where till then, if you look at economic history for 3,000 years, average living standards did not change for 3,000 years, okay? So the kings and the nobles lived better, but that's because as productivity went up, the population also went up, okay? So for 3,000 years of human history, we went through what is called extensive growth, where the increase in income is kept pace with the increase in population, okay? Now, kings and nobles are living better because you have more people to tax. So when we say, we were whether it's Mughal Empire or Nizam or whatever, were the richest people in the world, that's because you just had a large population and more people to tax. But average quality of life was unchanged, okay, those 3,000 years. So it's only at the time of the Industrial Revolution that you start seeing this big increase in GDP per capita, okay? But that increase is also accompanied by increased inequality, because most of the benefits of that growth go to people with physical capital, financial capital, human capital. So if you have land, if you have money, if you have education, those are the three groups of people who benefit from that. So along with the growth also comes massive inequality, okay? So it's only in the last 100 years that you get to the third wave of the nation state, which is the modern welfare state, okay? Where now governments are coming in and saying we can use progressive taxation to then distribute some of the benefits of growth, and then you get food security, healthcare, pensions, unemployment. So all of this is very, very recent, okay? So now 19th century Bismarck in Germany has a little bit of this, but that's only for the formal industrial sector workers, okay? So that's only about 5%. So the mass deployment of this happens only around 1930 and really takes off after World War II, okay? Now, the reason, and I'll come back to this, is that it's very expensive to build a welfare state, okay? So most high-income countries only built a welfare state after reaching a GDP per capita of about $18,000 to $20,000 in today's PPP terms, okay? Now, this is one fact. Now, there's a reason I'm giving you this history, okay? The other key part of these three phases of the state that people don't often appreciate is how tightly correlated it is with the amount of democracy that you have, okay? So the security state happens at a time when there's no concept of individual human rights, okay? Kings and rulers can do whatever they want. And even today, you go to North Korea, like that's what a security state looks like, right? You can be picked up and thrown in jail. There's no concept of kind of individual rights, okay? Now, what's very, very interesting is this industrial state in the US and the UK is correlated with a time of limited democracy. Okay. So these societies like to think of themselves as old democracies, but they're very, very flawed democracies, right? Because the vote is restricted to white property owning men. So only 20% of the population has a vote, okay? And it is not an accident that that is the class that is willing to vote for the infrastructure, because they are the ones who benefit. The capital, the value appreciation of their property happens when you build the infrastructure. Now, in the long term, the poor are benefiting from market integration and lower prices. But in the short term, the gains are going to those who own the property, okay? So it's not an accident that it is only when you get universal franchise that you get the political pressure for the welfare state, okay? And that's because in any any population, in any income distribution, if you're below the average, you want more welfare and redistribution. If you're above the average, you want lower taxes. So it's only when the franchise expands to cover the entire population that you get the political pressure for welfare. And that is why, if you look at kind of the evolution of democracy in the West, it's only in the last 100 years that you get universal adult franchise democracy. Okay. And you can see why I'm telling you this, because India is going to be this unique outlier in human history, that we are the only country that had universal adult democracy on day one. Okay. And that's going to have profound implications for the evolution of the Indian state. So this is then just showing you, if I look at OECD countries, US, UK, France, etc., till about 2020, there's no welfare, right? So the welfare, this is just social expenditure as a percentage of GDP. It starts picking up around the time of the Great Depression. But it really takes off only after World War II, okay? And that's because, like I said, welfare states are expensive. And so before you can fund the expenditure, you need people to be willing to be taxed, okay? So you need the state to be able to tax, and you need the population to be willing to be taxed. So, and that happens at the time of the World War, okay? Because it's an existential crisis that tax rates go up, okay? But then after World War, when you get peace dividend, that peace dividend is what is then converted into the modern welfare state, okay? Now, so what happens here is now, if you look at India, so this is this really powerful picture from Arvind Subramaniam and Rohit Lamba's paper, and it just shows that now you're putting the income on a constant axis, and at this level of income, the US and the UK had kind of democracy scores of under 2.5, which is roughly the fraction of the population that had a vote. And at that same level of income, India is basically starts highly democratic and stays highly democratic. Okay, so there is no precedent. There is just no precedent, okay, for a country doing something like this. Now, political scientists have talked about the kind of improbable democracy. What we've not discussed enough is then the downstream implications of that, okay, for the nature of the Indian state. And so what that means is there are huge positives, okay? So the huge positive is that it is a great moral triumph, okay, that has allowed every Indian, including the most marginalized, to participate in the political process, okay, well below their counterparts in richer countries. So it's given the most marginalized a voice, okay, which otherwise wouldn't exist, right? Now, it has also yielded substantial policy wins. So, for example, India does BDS for food security for the poor at a GDP per capita of $1,200 per capita. The US does it at $18,000. Okay. Even today, now, in this US presidential campaign, the Minnesota governor who's being considered for vice president is being criticized from the right for doing universal school lunch programs. Today, in the US. Okay. And in India, we kind of take that as kind of, an axiomatic human right that we do, that we are so proud of. Okay, so these are the great positives, okay, and it reflects a combination of elite top-down actions, okay. So many of these programs and Kamaraj midday meals or MGR built it up. It came top-down, but it was sustained by the bottom-up popularity, right? So that's why kind of you have this combination of ideas and the democratic interests that kind of keep that going. So this is the way in which India has been substantially different. And that's why it's a great moral achievement. But unfortunately, we are economists, okay, and we also know that there are budget constraints. And so there are also two major challenges that have been created by kind of India's democracy before development, okay. And the first is the public finance challenge, right? So one way to think about the facts I mentioned to you is, if I have so many investments that are giving me 10x ROI, why am I not doing it? Okay, and the reason you're not doing it is because the political demand, voter demand and political supply of a welfare state at a much lower level of income has squeezed funds for investing in public goods, including in the state itself. And one powerful example of this is the railways, right? That till about a decade ago, over 95% of India's rail stock was installed under the British. And that's because after independence, every railway minister has been under pressure to cross-subsidize and keep the fares low and kind of keep freight high and not have the money for the capex. Right? So that is one kind. So the problem is not welfare spending, okay? And this is why there's something in chapter 6 which I talk about a lot. The problem is not welfare. The problem is the low quality of welfare spending. And why do you have low quality? Because you're not invested in the administrative machinery to deliver well, till recently, and I'll come back to that. So then you're in this low level equilibrium, that low state capacity means poor quality of spending. And so then you kind of, because you need to spend even more money to get a certain amount of benefits, you have even less money for state capacity. So that is one public finance vicious cycle. Right? The second challenge is the political economy challenge. Okay, so the political economy challenge is that both the politicians and the voters know that the state they lead cannot credibly deliver for all citizens. Okay, so this is at least true till the 90s when the state was poor. Okay, and so that means the nature of politics becomes how do you direct the resources of the state towards your preferred interest group rather than create broad-based public good. And that is a natural consequence of a politics of scarcity. Right? And that's what gives rise to kind of the vote bank politics. And in a world where you also had fractured parties, multiple parties, and voting turnout was 60%, you could win elections with less than 20% of the total registered voters, which means that it makes more sense politically to cultivate a base that will show up rather than do broad-based service delivery. And that's also all explained in chapter 2. And that creates another vicious cycle between low state capacity and vote bank politics. So how do you break out of this? Okay, and of course, this is magnified by India's socio-cultural context. Okay, and this is, it's not just these structural factors. It's also true that given the mechanics of elections and the need to kind of, both raise money and mobilize voters, that there's been structural diversion of public resources towards three elite groups, okay, that Pranav Vardhan talked about in 1984, which is big businesses, large landowners, and government employees, okay. So you have kind of a diversion of, so both elite exit and elite capture. So elites have exited from receiving government services and have also captured a bunch of public resources. You have the magnified problem of social stratification, especially by caste, which makes it harder to create the broad social coalitions needed to build public goods, okay? So it's not an accident that some of the states that have done best, like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Maharashtra, have had social reform movements first that have demanded better services regardless of who's in power, okay? And then there's obviously gender and patriarchy, which also contributes to weak state capacity because it's typically women who disproportionately bear the burden. And there's a lot of research that shows how improving kind of women's representation improves kind of public good provision. Okay. So all of this has therefore resulted in a setup where we haven't invested in the capacity of the state to deliver. So my simple way of telling the story of Indian democracy is, Ram Guha, who's a famous Bangalore resident in his India After Gandhi, in the end, when he assesses Indian democracy, he says it's 50-50. Okay. When Ashutosh Vashni writes on 2013, he calls it battles half won. Okay. And in a way, I'm giving you a story for why that is true, which is the 50% full is that Indian democracy has given the marginalized the ability to make a claim on the state. The 50% empty is that we have not invested in the capacity of the state to meet those claims. Okay. And this is why I consider building a more effective state the great unfinished task of Indian democracy itself, because that's what it's going to take to deliver on the promise of one person, one vote into kind of greater equality of opportunity. Okay, so that's kind of why this is not just a technocratic project, it really is a nation building project, right? In terms of what we need to kind of fulfill the aspirations of our democracy. Okay, now, so this has then resulted in, again, most of you know this, and like, Dr. Vishal was saying, in a way, for most officers, you know everything I'm talking about, okay? There's nothing here that is truly new to you, okay? Except that this is now validated with conceptual frameworks, research, evidence, and brought together in a way that you can then, easily summarize. But there are deep structural challenges, okay? Deep structural challenges, including severe staff shortages. There's limited and misdirected accountability, okay? So everybody says there's no accountability. That's not true. There is accountability, but the accountability is all for compliance and not for outcomes, okay? So, and that itself affects how the bureaucracy functions. There's limited autonomy, there's poor capacity, skills, and limited opportunities for upgrading them. And we have strewn the paperwork. We were just talking about that in the Administrative Reforms Commission. And the average IAS officer still has a tenure of about 15 months, okay? Which is essentially impossible to do any deep and meaningful work in that kind of time. Now, there's also deep historical and complex reasons for this, okay? Including the colonial legacy, okay? The fact that we have built the modern Indian state on top of the structures of an extractive colonial state. Okay, so that colonial state was meant to extract and not to serve. And so many of the pathologies we have, so something simple. Why do we transfer people so much? Okay, the historical origin of this, But does anybody know? Historical origin was because the extractive colonial state did not want officers getting too close to the population. Okay, so it was called going native. Okay, so because you don't want your officers to feel humdardi, agar humdardi aa gayi to aap kaise lootoge, right? So remember, the most powerful officer is a collector. Okay, and you're supposed to collect. आपको चूसना है, आपको सर्व नहीं करना है. Okay, so अगर चूसना है तो अगर आप हमदर्दी आ गई तो कहाँ से चूसोगे? And again, you can see this entire thing in popular culture, right? Look at Lagan. Okay, so in Lagan, you've got Captain Russell, like who's your perfect colonial bureaucrat. Right? He's staying in the cantonment, Chavni mein rehke, he's playing cricket and doing shikar. Okay, but Elizabeth goes and mixes with the people and ends up feeling that humdardi. Okay, so it is precisely because you don't want the rulers to have humdardi with the population that you move them around. Okay, now that is a colonial legacy. Now today, why do we have it? The complex set of reasons, partly because the politicians realize if you can't fire civil servants, that transfer is the only tool they have, like for control. And then there's a bunch of other kind of structural reasons. Okay, but many of our pathologies kind of come from colonial origins that have absolutely no reason, okay, to exist the way they do right now. But I think that, right? Because system, we have done that. And then there's obviously political factors, because in a world where there is both what I call a democracy tax, right, where fighting elections is expensive and you need to be able to raise resources and you need to direct the resources of the state, you need control over the bureaucracy. So a key part of the underinvestment in the bureaucracy is kind of driven by political factors. There's economic factors, which is there is no accountability for cost effectiveness. There is judicial factors. Again, many of you know this. Public doesn't know this, right? Public doesn't know how many cases of vacancies in supervisory positions are because cases are stuck in courts. Okay, so in Gulzar and Somanathan's book on state capability, they have this beautiful term where they say judicial cases in personal matters are like a tapeworm within the system that kind of eats our ability to function that nobody outside is seeing. Okay, so there are all of these factors, and then there's obviously institutionalized risk aversion. Okay, so and all of you know, and I tell this, there's a reason this chapter is called bureaucracy's burden. Okay, which is you're juggling 100 kind of files, 100 balls, and if one thing goes wrong, like you're much more in trouble for that. Okay, so there's this phrase from Peter Shilton, the goalkeeper of the England team in the 1980s, where he says, "Few remember the ones you save, few forget the ones you let go." Okay, so similarly, like if you're an official, nobody remembers like all the great things you do. You do one thing wrong, like that 15 years later there can be an inquiry for that. Okay, so which means that institutionally we have built in risk aversion into the system. Okay, and then there is the fact that government work is inherently more challenging. So if I'm in the private sector, most of my efficiency comes from the fact that I don't serve most customers who can't afford to pay. Okay, so I can afford to target my services to people who can pay, whereas the government has a mandate of serving the entire population, which is an incredibly more complex task. Okay, and then there is this problem of premature load bearing, which is a term that comes from Land Pritchett. And the whole point is that when you put excess load on the system, more than what it can handle, it makes it even weaker. Okay, so the analogy, we are in the Olympics. Okay, so if you're a weightlifter and want to build your muscles, you would start by lifting 1 or 2 kilos more than your capacity, and bit by bit the muscles build till you can lift more. If I try to lift 100 kilos, I'll just die. Okay, because I'll collapse. So what happens when you overload a system is that the system actually collapses. So, and partly because, one of the ways I say this is, the time you spend, because remember there's limited resources. So there's this phrase I use in the books. It says in India, the government as legislature makes commitments that are beyond the capacity of the government as executive to deliver. And then government as judiciary holds government as executive in contempt of government as legislature. Okay. So, and then you are spending time kind of addressing the court to solve that individual problem. Okay. But that is, I'm solving this individual grievance, but that is diverting my time away. So every time when I have more claims than I have resources for, the time I'm spending adjudicating who gets it is time I'm not actually delivering. The time I'm then spent arguing about who should have gotten it and handling that litigation is again time I'm not spending delivering. So that's where you get an excess load further weakens the system, okay, which is something that we don't fully appreciate. And then, of course, there's elements of bureaucratic self-interest as well, and I don't know if Uma Mahadevanji is here, she was, but her review of NC Saxena's book, because NC Saxena has this famous book of blaming the IAS, and what I say is it's unfair, okay, but you can, there is some blame to be had over there, okay. So the point is, all of this, right? There's nothing here you don't know. But what I say in chapter 18 is that the goal of a book like this is to convert something from private knowledge to common knowledge, okay? And in game theory, there's a huge impact of that, okay? So when I did my first teacher absence study in 2003, any officer would say, हाँ, जब field में जाते हैं, हमको मालूम है absence problem है, okay? But that's not the same as having representative nationwide data showing that this is 25%. And then that becomes common knowledge that we are able to act on. So similarly, the goal of the book is to kind of take all the tacit knowledge that you already have and make it common knowledge that then allows us to build a reform agenda around that, okay? But that's why it really, you guys are the customers of the book, okay? It's written in a way that is kind of taking research and making it digestible and accessible, but you're the ones who have to run with it. And, I'm just here to kind of provide some frameworks. So the summary here is that we have just not yet completed the transition. It's not like we've not made progress, but it's an incomplete transition, okay? From being a colonial state designed to rule the population to a democratic state designed to serve them, okay? Now, in the interest of time, how are we on time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip the details of these 6 chapters because we have people who are reading them and actually discussing them, okay? So but this is kind of the intellectual core of the book because see, it's very easy to say state capacity, okay? But capacity hota kya hai? Now, one basic misconception that often happens in government, even when you talk to politicians, when you say capacity building, they think this is about training of officers, okay? But capacity building of officers is very different from capacity building of systems, right? So if you want to build effective systems, the people are one piece of it, okay? But these 6 ideas, they really come from organization theory, okay? It's not just applies to government, it also applies to the private sector. So in any company, the 3 things that drive kind of the culture of the organization is what are the outcomes that the whole org is trying to achieve. Second is what determines the promotion and personal prospects of people within the organization. The third is where is the money being allocated, which budgets, which divisions are expanding, which are contracting. Fourth, what is your revenue model, okay? Fifth, when we say federalism and decentralization, any multinational has to say the same thing. Head office mein kya hoga, local office mein kya hoga, field office mein kya hoga, right? So it is exactly that same set of conceptual issues. And the last of state and market is what should I produce in-house and what should I outsource? And even that requires kind of contracting and regulation capability, okay? So each of these are 6 core components of effective public systems. And the problem is, these are always important but never urgent, okay? So the last time we systematically invested in this was post-independence, when you built a bunch of institutions that were trying to do these things. And then after that, we are still living off those investments, okay? But we haven't systematically reinvested in saying, what does it take to build an effective state that is able to substantially improve the translation of resources into outcomes, okay? So there's a whole bunch of ideas here, but the structure of each of these chapters is each is about 25 to 30 pages, okay? But it's very tightly written. And the first half of each chapter is science and the second half is engineering, okay? So what I mean by that is the science is, or what I call social science and systems engineering. So social science is saying, here are the facts, here is the research, here is why we are the way we are, okay? So let's understand the status quo. And then based on that, how do you then build a pathway for improvement? So the second half is in the engineering, saying, how do I take that understanding to then build a better system, okay? And that's the structure of each of these chapters. So that just, on data, this is kind of how foundational these things are, okay? So this is an example, and again, all of this is coming from recent research in the past 15, 20 years, okay? That's, I think, the other key contribution of the book. So this is from Madhya Pradesh, where the government in the early 2010s kind of launched this massive initiative that Niti Aayog called a nationwide best practice, okay? So they were really committed to learning and education, and they said, we'll do this thing called Pratibha Parv, that every student is going to be assessed every year, and we're going to put their learning levels and make sure that the teachers are doing the work needed to get every child up to basic learning level, okay? So everything looks great, assessments are done, reports are filed, nationwide best practice, okay? Niti Aayog 2015, go look for it, okay? It's there. So, but then my colleague Abhijit Singh goes and does this very, very, very simple audit study, okay, where he goes to a whole bunch of these schools 2 months afterwards and retests a sample of the same children on the same question, okay? And what you see is in the official data, like there is no child who scores below 60%, 65%. In independent data, there is no child who scores above 65%. So the data has been fudged so dramatically that there is no resemblance. Now, there's one place it's not been fudged. The ranks have not been fudged. You see, because everybody understands that the ranks matter, but you inflate the levels because who wants to do the extra work? And we've got all of the codes, because even if you show the true levels, your boss is going to yell at you. See, nobody is going to then say, okay, systemically, this is what I need to support you. You're just going to yell. Okay. So in the government, I've spent enough time in government that you can't do performance-based pay. So what is the management tool you have is shouting. Right? So, and people don't want to be shouted at. Okay. So the best way to not be shouted at is to not show bad news. Okay. And this is not just Madhya Pradesh education. It's the Tamil Nadu. Okay, Tamil Nadu, one of our better functioning states, ICDS. In the official data, the rate of malnutrition is 8%. In the independent NNFHS, it's 30%. Now, why are these things foundational? It's because our entire policy approach to malnutrition is to say our regular SNP allowance is 5 rupees a day. But if you're malnourished, you'll get 9 rupees a day. But if you're misclassifying 90% of the children, how will you even start that downstream action? Okay, so that's why this is foundational. And why do I think of this as kind of the most important thing? Because in education, we wasted 20 years. We have wasted 20 years as a country. Because since 2005, Pratham has been doing independent assessor surveys to say we have a learning crisis. But in private, even if a joint secretary will admit that, in public, they have to work their official data. In public, they cannot accept the outsider data. And the inside data looks amazing. So in the official data, there is no learning crisis. Sab changa si. Right? And so there's this great quote from the Rukmini Banerjee, right? I mean, who went to a village and tested these kids, found they couldn't learn, went to the sarpanch and said, you know that your children can't learn. They said, no, I don't believe you. So then she showed. And then the education department official was there and got really upset. Okay. And he told her, madam, aapko asliyat se itna laga kyun hai? Okay. And so that's kind of why this is foundational. And we now have this techniques, we have the systems. So in Telangana, for example, so part of why the book took me longer is because over the last 5 years, 2019, I started writing, but we've also built this whole nonprofit called CGIS, right? Which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, to say, let's not just do armchair theorizing, let's actually work with governments to see, can you actually improve things? So Telangana has now become the first state in India for the first time to have a representative district level survey that will give you annual independent data on learning outcomes and nutrition that can be used to drive the whole system. Because what we realized from this Pratham NAS example is that the data has to be independent of the line department, but it cannot be outside the government, right? So that's why the planning department becomes so central, because you're within the government, but outside the department. So over time, the planning department's core role was to kind of have this kind of independent data, but over time, it has been reduced to collating the data from the department and reproducing it rather than independently collecting and validating the data. You see? So this is core state capacity. Core. So every one of these chapters then has a bunch of concrete ideas, okay, of what to do. So let me, so I'm going to jump, okay? So because personnel, we say weak state capacity. India has the lowest number of employees per capita. Okay, we have 16 per 1,000. The country like the US that we think of a paragon as market economics has 5 times, and obviously Scandinavian countries have 10 times. Okay, and one of the reasons is that our government employees' salaries are the highest in the world, not at the top. At the top 1-2%, we are massively underpaid relative to the complexity of the job and what that talent would get in the private sector. Okay, but at the bottom 96-98%, you're massively overpaid. Okay, so here teacher salaries in Andhra 6 times higher in government compared to the private sector. And there's a reason why you get 200 applicants per job, because we say private sector may have no jobs. No, private sector creates jobs at market wages. The government is the only entity that is offering terms that are so disconnected to the market that it's rational that people will try to kind of play the government job lottery. Okay, so there's a whole kind of discussion of how do we fix this, and then public finance. And maybe in the discussion, I'll talk more about this, because this is one of the core ideas in the whole book, okay, which is to say that if you improve kind of the analysis of public finance, what you'll see is, what do I mean by quality of expenditure, right? So for capital expenditure and a whole bunch of spending, you would think about return on investment. So any private entities allocating money would say, what is the ROI? Okay. Now in government, we are also interested in equity. We are not just maximizing ROI, okay? But you can look at spending, and every major spending item can be analyzed in this 2x2 framework. Okay. Now, what happens is a lot of our public discourse happens fighting about R2 versus R4. Okay, because there are some policies that will improve efficiency but hurt equity. Other policies that will improve equity through redistribution at the cost of efficiency. But where is the free lunch? the free lunch is, if you analyze the data, you'll see so much of our spending is actually in region 3, that is hurting both equity and efficiency. And we have so many ideas in region 1 that we are not spending. Okay, these are things that will improve equity and efficiency. So, simple thing, second worker in the ICDS. Okay, child rights advocates have been asking for 20 years, and again, we've not done it. But if you look at farm electricity subsidies, probably our single worst policy in the country, right? Because the 50% of the benefits go to the top 5% of the landowners. So it's one of the most inequitable subsidies we have. It is incredibly inefficient from the perspective of groundwater and crop diversification, and it has a whole bunch of other downstream costs. So there are so many things that we do that are notionally, like, for the poor, but are sitting actually in R3. So if you subject kind of the expenditure to basic incidence analysis of kind of distributional impacts and ROI, you can populate this framework and use that to guide, right, the budget allocation. So, and this is a powerful framework that cuts across, and I'm going to skip these guys, okay? So let me kind of wrap up by talking about why am I optimistic, okay? So despite all of these challenges, right, why am I optimistic? So the first reason to be optimistic is that the nature of our politics has changed, okay, compared to 25 years ago. So if you look at the data on elections, right, so there was an old politics of polarization, identity, vote banks, okay, which is, caste, region, religion, language, whatever. And there is a new politics of governance and service delivery, okay. And if you look at the data, I'm not saying that the old politics is over, okay, but the old politics only gets you 20%. To win, you need that next 20%, okay, which means that politicians are under pressure, okay, to figure out ways to deliver, which means there is political demand, but it's up to us to then say, how do you do this? Okay, so that's the first good news. The second good news is we have a lot more research to inform the how, okay? So, like, I'm going to take a step back to one of the great debates in development over the past 60 years, okay? So this is the great Bhagwati versus Sen debate, or the growth versus development debate, okay? So if I look at any development outcome, life expectancy, education, infant mortality, it is strongly positively correlated with GDP per capita. Okay? So rich countries do better on everything, rich states do better on everything. So the growth view is saying, listen, in the long term, the most important thing is growth. If you manage to get 2% faster growth for 20 years, 30 years, everything else will take care of itself. Okay, so just get the growth right. Okay, and historically, that was the World Bank IMF view, and in the Indian intellectual discourse, that's the Bhagwati Panagariya view. Okay, now the converse view, which is the Amartya Sen Jean Drèze view, is to say that the purpose of development is not GDP per capita. The purpose of development is to enhance human potential. Okay, and that human capabilities come from better health, better education. And if you look at this, they'll say, look at the positive outliers. Look at Bangladesh, Vietnam, Sri Lanka. These are countries that have managed to significantly outperform income, and they'll argue that you don't have to wait to get rich to get developed. Okay, so, and one powerful example is if you compare during the year of COVID, Sri Lanka had 0.1 years higher life expectancy than the US that year, even though the US had 15 times higher GDP per capita. And that's because the US system is among the most unequal and kind of most skewed towards kind of elite curative care compared to what Sri Lanka is. Okay, so you can see why both views are actually very powerful and influential. Okay, now, but what is my point of departure in this book? My point of departure is to say at one level, they're both right. Okay, so clearly growth is good because it helps human development. Clearly human development is good because it helps growth. So what are we fighting about? So we are fighting, essentially, it becomes a bit of an ideological fight. Okay, that the center right likes more capex and growth, and the center left likes more social sector. So my point of departure is to say, guys, this fight is still a zero-sum fight about budget allocation. But the elephant in the room is that the translation of that expenditure into outcomes is so poor, regardless of what you're spending. See, it's not somehow that capex is high quality spending. So if you're a Bombay economist, as opposed to a development economist, a Dalal Street economist will say capex is good quality spending. Okay, because they say, okay, it's not a big welfare. But if you look at our time and cost overruns, if you look at how much money we waste in capex, and our Devashish, I think he had this term of, the whole capex model is kind of build, neglect, rebuild. Okay, so there is so much low hanging fruit in improving quality of expenditure that my point, what I'm trying to do here, both in terms of policy and the intellectual discourse and development, is to say that let's kind of move away from just growth and development, because that's distracting us from the fact that you can do more of everything if you manage to improve the efficiency of the system itself. Okay, so that's kind of a core message. And if you then look at what this means for the global development discourse, it is for 20, 30 years, most of development economics was what should governments prioritize. But we were not asking, can the government do it? Okay, so that gives you this long list of well-intentioned failed policies. Okay, the next wave has been everybody understands state capacity is weak, but fixing state capacity seems too difficult. So what do? Everybody does PMUs. Okay, so we do PMUs to implement specific projects in mission mode. Okay, but that may help deliver projects. It doesn't help you build better systems. And those PMU-based projects might still be 2 or 3 or 5% of your budget. But the entire government machinery, you can't accelerate development. So I'm making now the argument for the third phase of both kind of research and practice about how do you strengthen public systems across the board, because that's going to be the force multiplier for every development goal that we have. Okay, so that's kind of the intellectual kind of positioning of the book. And now finally, I'm going to take 5 minutes to be optimistic. Okay, so this is one of the great successes in the second half of the 20th century. It's called the shifting of the Preston curve, okay, which is the x-axis is GDP per capita, the y-axis is life expectancy, but over time, okay. So what you see is between 1930 and 1960, that graph has shifted upwards, and in 2015, that's even further high. So what that means is today's low-income countries have much better outcomes than today's rich countries had when they were at the same level of GDP per capita, okay, which means that even at a level of poverty, you can do much better. So how is this magic possible? The main source of this magic is better knowledge and better technology. Okay, so and one powerful example in health is 100 years ago to date, in 1924, the president of the United States could not save his son from a simple bacterial infection that he got while playing tennis. Okay, he couldn't survive more than 1 week. Okay, because there was no antibiotics. Today, a poor daily wage laborer like him, it's a routine thing to take the antibiotics. You're fine. Okay, so over the course of history, how have we accelerated human progress? It has come from the creation of new knowledge, the transmission of that knowledge, and then acting on that knowledge, okay, at scale. Now, the good news is that in health, there is a strong tradition of doing this because there is a culture of evidence-based medicine, there's a culture of collating the evidence and a culture of the global health kind of community, then disseminating that into national policy priorities, okay? Now, over the last 20 years, how can we shift the Preston curve for governance more broadly? So asking the same question, what do today's developing countries have that today's high-income countries did not have at the same level? What do we have today? And the biggest asset we have is much better data and evidence on the quality of expenditure, right? So in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of better research because we have more data, more computing power, better research methods, and that's taught us so much more, okay, about how, and that gives us the free lunch, right? So there's enormous opportunities to improve spending quality because we have many very, very expensive policies and programs that have little to no impact. Other much less expensive things are not being implemented. So that is the free lunch, right? The free lunch is, I have, and let me just give you one very, very powerful example, okay, from my work in education. So this is, again, data from 6,000 kids in Rajasthan across 40 schools in 4 districts, no, more schools. Okay, and I consider this the most important picture to understand education in India. Okay, so what is the x-axis? The x-axis is the grade in which the student is enrolled. The y-axis is the learning level. Okay, now if these kids were making progress as per the curriculum, they should be on this 45-degree line. In practice, the true learning level is about half of that. Okay, so the average 8th standard kid has about a 4th grade level of understanding in mathematics. Okay, now what is more important is that because we have dynamic computer adaptive testing, that every dot here is about 10 kids. And what that shows you is that in this 8th standard classroom, you have kids at a 2nd grade level, 3rd, 4th, 5th, all the way up to 8th standard. Okay, so that is the kind of variation that you're dealing with in a classroom. And this is kind of, once you realize this, you realize why this teacher's job is humanly impossible. I'm dealing with this kind of variation. So one problem is absence and accountability. But the other problem, now think about a sincere teacher. A very sincere teacher, motivated teacher, you go to school. What do? You complete the portion. You complete the text. But that is so far above the level of most of the kids that it is not translating into any impact. So અત્યારે આ ભાષણ વચ્ચે હું બીજી ભાષામાં વાત કરવા લાગુ તો કેટલા લોકોને સમજણ પડે છે? હું ગુજરાતી વાત કરું છું તો જેટલા લોકોને હિન્દી સમજમાં આવે એને થોડું ખબર પડે કે હું શું કહું. પણ હું શું કહું છું? હું સૌથી ક્વોલિફાઈડ પ્રોફેસર છું, બહુ મોટિવેટેડ છું, સિન્સિયરલી ભણાવું છું. પણ હું જેટલા પણ તમને ભણાવું તમને વધારે સમજ નથી આવવાની. કેટલા લોકોને સમજ પડે છે હું શું કહું છું? Right? Gujarati, right? So what have I just done to you? Right? I have given you 30 seconds in the shoes of a typical kid in a typical classroom in India. It doesn't matter how qualified the professor is, doesn't matter how motivated you are, doesn't matter how sincere, doesn't matter how much you're increasing the budget. If you're not addressing the binding constraint. So the reason I'm giving you this example is the power of the data and the research. Now I can give you visibility of what is going on inside the classroom that then helps you understand why your typical spending is not having an impact. And how you can do much more cost-effective things if you look at the data carefully. Right? So that's just one example. But then the point of the book is sector after sector, we have research and we have examples that can improve the quality of expenditure. Okay, so I'm going to end by kind of saying, why is this such a big deal? Okay, today we have about 35% standard. If you just extrapolate from the time trend of the last 15 years, at 6% annual GDP per capita growth rate in 2047, we will still have 25% standard. Even if you manage, because our translation of income into reduced stunting has been so poor. Even if you manage to grow at 8%, you will only get to 22. But if you manage to double the effectiveness of how we translate spending into outcomes, then even at 6% growth, you will achieve 17%. And then if you achieve that, that can give you a tailwind to higher growth. And that makes it more likely that you will achieve 18%, achieve 8%. And that's going to dramatically improve the outcome. Same in learning. In our current, if you continue as we have over the past 15 years, even in 2047, 16% of kids will complete primary school without being able to read. At 8%, you bring that to 2046. At doubling, you bring it to 2038. And then if you grow at 8%, you come to 2030. So why is so much of our focus, even in our work and at CGIS on kind of early childhood development and education, is because the future of these children is not yet written. This is completely in our hands. So today, if I have to do skilling, there's political demand for skilling because 18-year-olds vote and children don't. Okay, but like the ROI on kind of getting these first 10 years right is so much higher. And this is in our hands, we can do it. And the consequences for human welfare, if we continue at the current rate, we're going to have another 200 million kids we will produce because you have to integrate under that curve. Over the 25 years, by 2047, we would have produced another 200 million children who will complete school without being able to read. And it is in our hands to kind of bring that down sharp. And which is why that KPI survey becomes a foundational investment. Because that's what every single year, otherwise NFHS will come once in 5 years and say that, oh, it's just enough to have conferences and seminars, but not enough to hold anybody accountable. But we now have the ability to collect this data annually independently and use that for goal setting, progress monitoring, course correction, and a whole bunch of downstream action. So my last slide is, like I said, this is the core of building an effective state. This is this key intellectual chapter of how do you shift the Preston curve for development. And then why do I focus on these 6 sectors? Because in these sectors, we don't have to choose between Bhagwati and Sen. Because Amartya Sen will prioritize what is intrinsically important. Bhagwati will prioritize what is important for growth. But every one of these sectors is both intrinsically important because even if I don't work, being more educated, so historically, the instrumental approach to investing in education will underinvest in girls' education. Why? Because the female labor force participation is lower. Okay, which is why many households if you have budget constraint, will prioritize the boys because of the labor force participation. So from an intrinsic perspective, that is not allowed, right? Because they're equally important intrinsically because it makes you more empowered. Health, again, even if I'm not productive, it is good. Safety is intrinsically good. Justice. I mean, think about the human rights consequence of our dysfunctional court system. That 70% of our under trials are held without being found guilty. So that makes a mockery of the whole idea of innocent until proven guilty. But it is not just intrinsic human rights, it's also instrumental. Every one of these sectors. Better education and skills gives you productivity. Better health and nutrition gives you productivity. Better public safety gives you productivity. Better courts gives you productivity. Social welfare is again intrinsically important, but a well-functioning welfare system also matters for growth, which people don't always understand. And that's because any activity, think about farmer crop diversification. Okay, we want them to move out of paddy to a higher yielding crop. But what all of our microeconomic research and development shows is any time I'm investing in something new, there is risk. And in the first few cycles, I will lose money. So having the right design of social protection just provides you enough insurance to be willing to take that risk to get to a higher level equilibrium. The connection between social welfare and jobs is so strong. So for example, one of the easiest ways to improve kind of growth is to increase urbanization, because the average urban wage is about 2 to 2.5 times higher. But one of the reasons we don't get more migration is that all our welfare programs are tied to being in the rural area. So you have actually made it so much more expensive to leave, because you lose your narega. You lose a whole bunch of your farm subsidies. So our welfare programs actually keep you poor. So the president of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, has this great phrase where he says, instead of social safety net, we should be building social safety trampolines. Because a net catches you when you fall, but then it's absorbing. But you want to catch and bounce back. Whereas a lot of our welfare programs are actually nets that keep you poor. So there is a deep connection between social welfare design and jobs and productivity, which is again not often understood. So all of those linkages are. And then finally, the beginning says even under the current incentives of politicians and bureaucrats, politicians are desperate for delivering, and even the bureaucracy is frustrated. And so it's time that we do this. And then the last two chapters are saying, okay, most of the agenda here is really for top-down action, but what can we do at a bottom-up level? Okay, and so how do you reimagine institutions? And a key point here is that at independence, most of our institutions are created at national level. But it's now time for states to imagine, because states are bigger than most countries, and we can do an institutional reimagination at the state level itself. And then the last chapter has a whole bunch of ideas for how a very broad range of actors can contribute in their own way. Okay, so I'm sorry I'm over time, but let me stop there. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic, Professor Karthik. Now I will request the panelists to kindly come on stage, please. Shri T.K. Anil Kumar, Ms. Priyanka, Madam Kaveri, Mr. Ranadi. I would request them to please come on stage. Mr. Anuchet is here. Mr. Anuchet is here. I think Mr. Manivannan and Jafar are busy in some other thing. I would request. To start with, I would request Mr. Randeep to kindly address the, please. Shall I? Yeah. I request each speaker to just read over 3 to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, sir. I'll just keep it lesser than that. But what a fascinating conversation we have just had. I really should applaud you, Professor, for having put things in perspective, and especially at a problem which is so real and staring at all of us, and especially those in the bureaucracy like us who profess that we are here to bring some change, try to have whatever small impact that is there to have to bring that out. So great listening to you, and as Secretary of Department of Personnel, Government of Karnataka, I think it's all the more relevant hearing you some of these which you have heard earlier before, but definitely not in the perspective that you have put across in terms of how small changes have long-term impacts and how we really need to reinvent the wheel. While we really know what to do, we're not really doing it the right way. Thank you again for stressing that personal management remains the very core of it. And the way we kind of complain about staff shortages, unstable tenures, and the limited autonomy we have, we could very well be the change agents ourselves, only if you think a bit too differently, rather than depending too much on, say, the permanence of bureaucracy in terms of ensuring that what you call the unconditional pay hikes, that I think my colleague, Dr. Vishal, would endorse, that unconditional pay hikes at the end of the day do not translate into any kind of effective governance. So that is something which has been an eye opener for us. And your book also, as I was reading the chapter 5 on personal management, talks about how our selections are also credential based, which means we look at a degree, we look at some marks, and then actually select somebody, which may not really be the best way to deliver. In fact, Dr. Vishal has also been an advocate that we should always have some kind of a limited test where we assess a person's capability before we take them into the government system. And not necessarily it needs to be a long-term job. Your 4-5 very important pointers of getting in HRMIS as a change agent, looking at a competence-based career progression plan for the bureaucracy. You also talked about apprentice-based models, which have been talked about earlier, but you have kind of given some live examples to see how this can work in today's settings. So I think all these are excellent ideas. I think as administrators, we need to take this to the next level, probably ensure that we do our task allocation better, our choices of personal management much better. There is a very interesting anecdote as I was reading the chapter, and it said that one of the IAS officers was asked, what do you guys do in the Department of Personnel? And the staff very proudly said, we are here to transfer everybody. So that is the whole understanding of the Department of Personnel. I really hope all of us can join hands here and ensure that we can bring about change. And thank you, Professor, again for this enlightening talk. Thank you.
Randeep, just a minute. Can you just? No, you can.
Yeah.
I request all the panelists to comment on what are the things, ideas that Professor Karthik Muralidharan has mentioned, has proposed. Which of them are implementable? What are the constraints for implementation?
Sure.
If there are some projects, there are some ideas that cannot be implemented. And even in implementing some of the feasible ideas, there may be some constraints that have to be
Yes.
overcome. So if you can mention those, I think it will
Yes.
enrich the conversation.
Yes, I'll just mention a couple, sir, and then leave it to the other panel. So one is, of course, the HRMS, which anyways there is there in the system, sir. And sir, as you have also chaired the Karnataka Administrative Reforms Committee. As I said, many of these ideas have always been there, and sir has also been mentioning this. So HRMS is something that helps us fetch data, because I'm also in my capacity as health commissioner. One of the largest constraints is to find out which doctor is working where for how long. And having a system in place makes it that much more easy to ensure the minimum security of tenure is given, and there is a system of evaluation also which can be done.
Yes.
Apart from that, I think the biggest challenge would be that how do we kind of ensure, because the fundamental basis of the Indian bureaucracy is permanence, and in terms of bureaucracy being a career, in terms of it would be a paradigm shift to actually tell people that you're there for a short time. And we are looking at skilling you, probably upgrading your skills and allowing you to move on. Once we have somebody younger or somebody who's more skilled coming, I think that would be the challenge, sir, that how do we transform from a career-based bureaucracy and a staff system to something which is medium term and where we are more focused on performance. Because all said and done, people would question that what would be, while performance pay, related pay is always an additional kind of an incentive, but people would still say that I'm looking at bureaucracy as a career, and I'm looking at something which can help me compete with the private sector. So I think one of your chapters also, Professor, mentioned about how we are paid much more than the private sector, if I'm
Not at the top.
So you've been telling that the public servants are paid higher. So I would really like to see that in perspective. If really we are being overpaid, and that is leading to some kind of non-performance on the ground. So that's for us to kind of introspect, sir. And definitely in terms of the transfers, I think probably concepts like the Civil Services Board, which probably certain states have adopted, certain could not adopt, bringing in some element of security of tenure. I think that remains a challenge. That's where the bureaucracy and the political executive have to work together and ensure the minimum security of tenure is given to officers so that they're able to perform, and including the staff, they're able to perform. So that would be the other point, sir. And issues like lateral entry, which again is being talked about. Probably I'd like to hear Professor's remark in terms of how lateral entry has actually help the Indian bureaucracy, because we've seen it over the last 4-5 years. Whether that is a concept or a thought that we would like to broad base it in the coming days. We also, because I recollect hearing Barack Obama say that the Indian bureaucracy is very parochial and resistant to change. And if we really have to change that, would systems like lateral entry and having new thought processes help us? So that's all from my end, sir. I would request the other panelists to kind of share their views.
I'll just say a couple of quick reactions. So thanks so much. And see, I think frankly, in the 3 to 5 minutes, I just see this as an opening, like a set of conversations, and we'll be happy to have more detailed follow-ups based on specific ideas that you think are worth to address. So I think that's one. And I think the one idea which I mentioned, which I do think is doable in a way that should not face resistance. See, I'm not talking about changing the structure of the permanent bureaucracy. So that will stay. Right? But if you look at any government department today, it is taken over by consultants. Right? And that's basically because you don't have the capacity, right? I mean, there is no capacity. And so and the consultants fill this gap of both skills and accountability. Right? So one simple idea I have is to say, and this is a way, it's not quite lateral entry, but it's a way of augmenting state capacity with skills and accountability, is to say, because the problem with a lot of lateral entries, it's become very ad hoc. You need a standardized process. So the idea is to say the UPSC exam, for all of its recent kind of challenges, it remains one of the cleanest systems we have, like in the country. So in our status quo, we kind of select the top 0.1% for permanent jobs. So why not take the top 1%, right? And empanel them and saying we will give you a certain amount of foundational training, and then you are eligible for contractual appointment in any government office, any government department, based on fitting between your interests and that job. So then, you get some combination of the procedural sanctity of the UPSC with the additional element of
the KPS.
Exactly.
Yes, KPS.
Exactly, as the case might be. So those might be some practical things that we could take up. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Nandi. Thanks, Professor, for responding. I request Madam to please address.
Good evening to all of you. I think even on the dais as well as in the audience, I see many experts who can speak on this. But still, since I'm holding this position, maybe I have been asked to speak about it. I think the book has managed to bust 3 myths in education. One is improving school infrastructure may create an enabling environment for better learning. It by itself is not sufficient unless it is accompanied by other enabling conditions. I think this is something that we keep arguing about. We keep demanding that a lot of investment should happen for the infrastructure in order to attract enrollment. And so here in this book, we are being told that this is really not all that necessary. Qualification and pay of a teacher has very little impact on improving learning outcomes. Hiring government teachers has led to modest learning gains. I think this is also a very, I should say, a statement which is debatable. Presently, we are having 52,000 vacancies. 42,000 are in primary and 10,000 are in high schools. But I have I wouldn't say a disagreement, but higher the class, I think you need teachers who are specialized. Of course, it has led to recruitment of guest teachers because that is how we are making up with these vacancies. I think in the book, the premise that there is you do not really need teachers with very great qualification in order to ensure that students attain minimum learning competencies. Then budgets that are sanctioned for inputs, that is MDN, textbooks, uniforms, shoes and socks, computers, laptops, etc. These are critical components according to me. But here in the book, it is said that this is necessary but need not translate into achievement of learning outcomes. Here, with regard to MTM also, I did see, but I think we need to really know whether giving food or the free lunches, has it really affected the enrollment? Personally, I feel it has made a lot of difference. I personally believe in this. So, when you look at these 3 things, I think the narrative in the media has to change. And also, whatever is happening with the PILs. I think all the PILs in the government is being pulled up because we are not providing the civil infrastructure or we are not filling up vacancies. So these are the things we need to be really addressing. And two important interventions have been suggested. That is with regard to governance. That is, in order to ensure attendance of teachers, it is not necessary that the post need be filled. Even filling up supervisory posts, it can create lot of difference. Presently, I think I would like to say that definitely we have supervisory posts and also even there also there are vacancies. I think it is a good point that we need to dwell on. Then with regard to giving monetary incentive in order to make the teachers effective, but how do we assess it? Because, assessing is the major problem. How do we actually, it is a very, very difficult, it's a very big challenge for us. And also fixing accountability. I think the presence of strong teachers union in the primary schools, I think that has become a debilitating factor for us. We have to acknowledge this. Then at the same time, we are talking about, I think you are talking about pedagogical interventions, where you have mentioned that grade appropriate competencies attained by the children varies from child to child. It is necessary to address those students who are behind grade level standards. I fully admit this because even I think when we look at the recent SSLC results, copying is there. I think rote learning happens. That is the reason our students are forced to copy. After the SSLC results were declared, we had actually introduced CC cameras. The results declined by 30%. And we had to give grace, which actually marginally helped the results actually got improved by 20%. But then it is a reality that, a student actually comes up to class 10 without learning anything. That is without even able to read or write or even do basic mathematical operations. Where did we go wrong? I think this is what we need to ask ourselves. What are the that is, you are talking about foundational literacy, numeracy. What should be the focus of the education department? I think it is not just that it should be done on a mission mode. We cannot say that you do this year or next year. I think this should be an eternal thing that we have to keep focusing on because every year there will be new entrants of children coming to our classes. You have also mentioned about implementing a practicum-based teacher training and selection program of 2 to 4 years for this elementary teachers. That is, it can be a 2-year diploma and also 4 years for a degree, and also providing extra points in teachers recruitment. And also, it is also mentioned that I think whatever training we do for the practical, practicals, that is going to the field or going to the school and teaching, at least 7 months should be devoted. That is 70% of the period should be devoted. I think it's a very good suggestion. It will also help us. It will also help the department. And right now, of course, no consideration, external consideration is there in our recruitment. Giving this extra points, maybe we can dwell on this. That is, now we are considering 20% of TET marks, 50% of CET marks, 20% of the degree, and 10% will be for DEd or BEd. But this giving this extra points for the tenure they have done, it also has to be done in a very, very transparent way because the integrity should not be lost. This is what happens when we decide to introduce some points. There is every chance that some kind of manipulation happens, which should not be allowed. Then one more important thing that is spoken in the book is about school size optimization. Small schools, I am just exactly quoting or citing what is there in the book. Small schools, no doubt, means compromise on education quality. So this is, you have mentioned like this. Of course, you also say that this consolidation of schools will have to be accompanied by making transportation facilities available. It should go along with it. I do agree with it, but only thing, one apprehension we have is when the school closes, there should not be any danger of a new private school entering there. I think this is what we have to be very, very focused about. And also, we also have to take into account the community resistance, which you have mentioned in the book, and also the teachers' resistance. And also, you have varied pressure groups, including the MDM employees. So, tackling all this, I think that's a very, very important challenge. And also, this is also very important. I think this kind of an exercise would not have received the favorable view probably earlier. But I think now we are in a stage where we should be thinking about this, but it should be done in a way so that our enrollment is not lost. I think that should be the major consideration. And investing in preschool education, I think this is something that education department is also very, very vocal about. I think now we are having something like in 2,786 schools, ECC has been introduced. But this is where we actually observe that this intervention actually benefits education department, but this is not something in the hands of education department. It is with women and child development department. I think the two departments need to speak to each other. I think this is the biggest challenge that we foresee. And what is the strategy that we should be having for co-located Anganwadis that are there in the schools? Then you also mentioned about the success of ITK in Tamil Nadu, where the volunteer-led intervention has been hugely successful. I think we can also think about it because already government is also giving 2,000 rupees for all the unemployed graduates. Then leveraging technology, I think it is rightly pointed out that whenever we speak about technology, we only think about procurement of computers to schools or laptops to schools, and nothing happens because O&M is not there, and also there is no separate instructor, and also what are we going to teach? Whether is there a digital curriculum? All these things are really not thought out. These are the things that we should be thinking about. And examination reforms, of course, we are also I think the education department has already introduced many of the examination reforms, like introducing 3 examinations, improvement examinations, we call that. So definitely examination reforms are really required. But when I say examination reforms, the reform should actually begin from higher education. Higher education, then it should come, because if we do any kind of reforms or simplification or even learning outcome based reforms, because none of our textbooks are learning outcome based. Even the questions that are there in the textbooks are not learning outcome based, or something that that will make the teacher think, or even the student think. So this is, I think it is all interconnected. Then with regard to skilling and vocational education, I think we can only we can, even after so many years, we are only talking about handful of schools. It has not been a widespread intervention that has happened. Even now we are talking about around 300 to 400 schools, that's all. So I think one of the statements that has been made is, if the economic return to a degree without skills falls, it will also reduce the demand for such degrees and raise the demand for skills. I think this is an important point I felt. We should actually ensure that degree should not be made as the be all and end all for every employment. And you have also spoken about leveraging private schools for public good. I think you also have mentioned about how the government can actually come up with a ranking system which will help the parents to actually assess the schools as to how which schools is faring better, and it should be done in a very fair and transparent manner. You are also talking about this charter school model. I think charter school models, in a way, we are also implementing, where we are allowing CSR funding to schools, where through CSR funding and also the school actually, the organization even provides quality interventions. I think a very successful example is Ramgondanahalli School in Bangalore. They have done so remarkably well because they have provided their own teachers. They are providing so many initiatives. I think it is better than a private school, according to me. Better than an NPS school is what my personal feeling is. It all could happen because a few of very dedicated people actually came and they supported. But is it possible to find such dedicated people to, take over so many of our schools? That is the question. So thank you so much. I think I have overstepped my time, but I thought I should tell. Thank you, because there are so many projects.
Thank you, Kaveri for touching upon all the reform ideas and giving your perspective from a implementer's point of view. Some of the ideas you have said can be implemented. It's a very good sign. Thank you.
Now we have Mr. Anuche, who is a 2009 batch IPS officer. He's worked across a couple of districts as the superintendent of police and is a joint commissioner of traffic in Bangalore. Anuche, over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, sir. It was a quite an enlightening 1 hour of talk from Professor Karthik. I'll just stick to the chapter on police and public safety. I was told today morning, so I could just read that. I wish I had prepared better and read the entire book because there are multiple chapters connected to it. If you read the first part of the chapter, it makes quite a bleak picture of public and police and public safety. I just wanted to reassure anyone who's read the book that it's not that bleak. For example, it says that there's a lot of low education levels up to class 10 in the police department is changing a lot. In the most recently conducted recruitment examination for police constables, 87% were graduates. 6% were postgraduates, few even doctors, and just 6% were the 7% were the rest who just barely qualified for the class 12, right? But just had a class 12 degree. So the kind of education level seen in the police department is definitely improving. But that brings up this other challenge that how do you find a meaningful job for what they have studied, right? Because if you want to do danda policing, you want class 10 people. So if you want to do something better or something like shift from the colonial to the serving the public, you need educated people. So that's changing. You also cite India Justice report of 2019. It says on the women constitute only 7% of police. I can probably say Karnataka is way ahead of that. This is because again of a state-led this thing where 20% of jobs were reserved for women in the police department, and today they are about 14%. I think they will be 20% shortly. In the traffic department where I work in, at the inspector level, 22% of women. At the ACP level, 30% of women. At the DCP level, 50% of women. Right. So it is improving. I think at the officer level, it's certainly improving, and at the constabulary also, that's going to keep on improving. Now, everybody knows that police is understaffed, overworked, underpaid. But what happens is that there is, question is how much do we spend on police? Now, as per the UN requirement, it's 222 police per lakh of population, and in India, I think we are at about 120. And if you take the actual strength, probably we are at 100 per lakh of population. Is the answer to that increasing the police personnel? Probably not, given that we don't spend too much on police, and it's not possible to spend. I think other sectors definitely require more than police. So I think we can look at leveraging technology. To give an example, in Bangalore City, we have 400 junctions manned by police, which are also signaled. 500 which are not manned, which are not signalized but manned. So about 900 junctions are manned by police. With the kind of technology existing today, we don't have to man any of them. Right? So can we look at these things? So that would be saving 900 personnel into 2 shifts. So you would be saving 1,800 personnel for that. So that's a simple example in traffic police. I'm sure there are multiple areas across multiple levels of government where technology can be leveraged to reduce the manpower requirement. And with the ingress of AI coming in, I think there'll be a premium for human labor, right? So I think we need to be in a position to leverage that. Professor Karthik has given 3 wonderful ideas regarding what reforms need to take place. One is improve the measurement of public safety. I think that's long overdue. I don't think we measure public safety in terms of the perception of a common person, right? Like to give an example, like a person on the road who's eve teasing a woman is a hazard to public safety, right? A woman would see that as a hindrance to her safety. But we don't classify rowdy like that, right? We have general this thing. So for a police, he's not a rowdy. Somebody else, he should have committed a murder or whatever to become a rowdy. So I think it'll be really wonderful to see how a common person views public safety, and if police is judged as per that barometers of public safety. The second reform idea with regard to competency-based career management for existing staff. I don't know how far this will be politically palatable, because I don't know, because right now, no person is chosen because of his competency for it. So I don't know how that would work, but if that happens, I mean, that's the moot question, right? How do we decide a person for that particular posting or that particular job? With regard to the third idea of creating a practicum-based diploma, I think it's a very good idea, but with the sheer number of people wanting to join the police, even if some of the officers who don't get into the police department are absorbed by the private security and this, what happens to those who are not absorbed by them also? I think that has to be looked into, whether it is a meaningful degree for them to have a decent living if they don't get into the police or even the private security sector, needs to be seen. The fourth, from my view, would be that we need to catch them young. At the school level, I think our children need to be educated on and need to be made aware of laws and what is a penal deterrent, right? In theory, we have social deterrent wherein you find out through your family, friends, whatever, what is wrong, what is right. But I think as a student myself, I never learned about any of these things as a student. Nobody told me that this is bad, this is wrong in terms of the legal terminology, right? I think we need to tell them, and our students need to be made aware of what are the penal provisions and what is right, what is wrong, right? I think that would be a good deterrent for children at a young age. Why I tell this is that we did an analysis of the educational background of people committing accidents, and we found that 60% have only a primary or a high education. So we are missing out a big chunk of the thing, and we are doing a disservice if they are not made aware of their laws as well as their rights. We touch upon how police is seen as an instrument of brutality and speak about custodial deaths and human rights violations and all that. I think many are not even aware of what their rights are. I think that should be part of some school curriculum, and or at least the higher education, higher schools from 8th to 10th standard. I think they need to be made aware of what their rights are and what are the penal deterrents in law. I think that's very important, and that's missing somewhere in our system. That would be my one small suggestion, apart from using the technology as a force multiplier and to overcome the understaffing. Thank you so much for you.
Thank you, Anuchet. Anuchet has been one of our best officers in using technology for the better police. He's a pioneer in this, and where you have great relevance.
I request T.K. Anil Kumar sir.
Professor Karthik Muralidharan, Shri Vijay Bhaskarji, members of the dais, and ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. I just want to echo what Sandeep told before. It has been a very fascinating lecture within 1 hour, giving us a good perspective on issues that are very dear to the government sector. It's also apt that we are discussing this when we are talking about Viksit Bharat and the 2047 targets that are set. But it puts a mirror on what is being done, and the key takeaway that I look at is your Preston curve, pushing the Preston curve. You have the knowledge, you have a data-driven approach. You can make a much better change than government as usual. So I was told to look at this chapter on health and nutrition. You talked about health and nutrition. Health is a very complicated topic. It has market failures, information asymmetry, catastrophic expenditure implication, and the lack of power of the consumer. India has done well, like the lecture you mentioned. We have done pretty well, B plus, but there's a long way to go because there are, in comparison to countries like China, Vietnam, we still are very, very far behind. You talk about the expenditure in health, it's around 2%. It ought to have been higher. The private sector has a huge role to play here. They provide better services and they cater to nearly 75% of the services. Public sector has its poor quality, unpredictable, poor access. So a lot of people don't go there, and there is an exit of the elite who have stopped using public health infrastructure. You mentioned about the cost effectiveness, the need to look at cost effectiveness, and of course the larger issue of the nutrition challenge, stunting 35%, and a lot needs to be done. Health has another angle to it, is the intersectoral. It's just not what you do in health, but you need to look at pollution, you need to look across other departments as well to make a change. What you have suggested is that you need to focus on preventive public health care over curative, because curative is, as per the book, it's around 80% of the expenditure is in curative, and we need to go into preventive health care. You have to address cross-departmental issues, invest in medical education, practicum-based training, nursing and paramedical, which can make an impact. Augment staff through local hiring, which more people are willing to work locally. You need to provide incentive to doctors so that they perform more, they attend to more patients. Digital health is another field which can make a huge impact, especially for poorer patients. You also mentioned about it's better to build district hospital. Now you have better roads, you have access. So rather than spreading the jam too thin, it's better to have district hospitals. You talked about the voucher system, how PMJAY, the Ayushman Bharat scheme can be expanded to preventive healthcare as well. And look at a mission mode for child nutrition, and an extra person at the Anganwadi can make a huge impact. We need to clarify our role as policymaker, regulator, and provider. That's very critical, is what you mentioned. So this is as far as what you had mentioned. I thought I'll just mention 3 or 4 points that. So first, health is a very complex sector. So putting Assam, Bihar, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu all in one chapter is very difficult. Because if you look at infant mortality rates, it's 8 in Kerala. We are at 22. The other states are 3-digit figures. So there's a huge variation across states. So it's very challenging to kind of paint it with a single brush. But yes, a data-driven approach, HR being the key, decentralization, and the role of market. These are things that we need to address, is what you have correctly mentioned. So what I would like to mention is that many of these aspects, there are parts of the book that have already been implemented in parts, but not in totality. So medical education, we are a state which has 68 medical colleges. We have 22 public medical colleges. There are over 700 nursing schools here. There are some 500 plus. It has its impact. I mean, it benefits the state, especially what we did see during COVID. There are incentives to doctors that are given. Evening clinics were opened up, but it's not system. I mean, there's not a system to it, but there is scope for doing that. The National Health Authority and what they are doing, creating a platform. These are all very interesting things. 3 observations. One, you talked about practicum-based training for augmenting staff, contract employment. Our worry as bureaucrats is people can come inside the system, they never go out. It's a big challenge. So you have, I mean, people who do really good work, they also become militant. So it's a big question mark. So how do you handle that kind of a setup? Second, you mentioned about the credentialing, the informal providers. A lot of doctors don't have the degree and they are practicing. So you are saying that they should come on board, formalize them, but the law does not permit it. So we can't split our thought on that. It's not permitted. We either ignore them or ban them. So banning is a solution that we look at. So that's a challenge for us. You mentioned about district hospitals. Ideally, a very good suggestion, but politically, how does it work? I mean, it's a big challenge. Especially in our state, there's a north-south divide, but the northern people are still looking for infrastructure. And the southern part is blessed. So, in a Mandya kind of a situation where you needed 10 PHCs, you have some 30 PHCs. In a Raichur, which we needed 30, we are still with 11 or 12 PHCs. So there is a demand for that, and that will make an impact. So it's a big challenge for it. I will just close with some 4 questions. I mean, some just food for thought. One is spending. You do mention across the book that it's not the amount you spend, but the amount also matters. Health is highly underfunded. It's 4% of the budget that we get. Typically, it should be 8%. It's 2% of GDP. It should be 3 or 4%. Unless that funding comes in, getting a change, I don't know how feasible it is. And but with funding again, health policy is just recent. We started our policy in 1983. We didn't have a health policy. In the last 2 decades, we're kind of figuring out what a health policy is. So given this recent policy structure that we have built up, the biggest thing is how do we define our roles? The curative part has huge political push. The classic case is Yashaswini scheme here. A lot of papers are written that it didn't provide the benefits as it did, but it is back. So the curative part has a huge political pressure to get in. So unless we bring that clarity, and how do we bring that clarity is a big challenge. I mean, that's something we struggle. But as you said, preventive is required. But how do we break from the curative to the preventive is one question. Second is institution building. You talked about institution building in the later chapter, but institution building is key. And if I look at health, there are 3 or 4 things that we need to do. And that if you crack those 3 things, like out-of-pocket expenditure is basically medicines and diagnostics. Who provides it? The Medical Supplies Corporation. If I create the institution and develop it, Tamil Nadu did that, Rajasthan did that, they broke it. So institution building is very critical. This is the core of your thing, but we need to identify those institutions. The jump that you get is much higher if you crack 2 or 3 institutions, and we can make a huge amount of difference. Last is, again, I'm always confused about this, the role of the private sector. The private sector is one of the most unregulated sectors across the various sectors. What should be the role? You've been very positive about the role of the private sector. I have my own apprehensions on that. The cost, I mean, the Honorable Supreme Court is now looking at cost of charges, because I can do a procedure at 3,000 rupees in Victoria Hospital. The same thing costs 1.5 lakhs if I go to a private. So that's a big question mark. How do we kind of address it is the question. I conclude with that. Thank you.
Issues.
And everything requires like extensive. So this is like an opening, opening.
And no one better than Anil Kumar to address these issues because of his long experience in the health sector.
I request Ms. Priyanka Mary Francis. Madam is the director of the NGMA, previously across districts, plus HOD of in the RDPR department. Madam, over to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. It was a fantastic 1 hour talk on and then exposure to the thoughts of Professor Karthik in this evening for all of us. Again, I am here to touch upon the health and nutrition chapter as well as the social protection and the welfare schemes chapter. Already Anil Kumar sir has gone through the takeaways from the health and nutrition chapter. Some of the points that from my background of having worked in the Department of Panchayat Raj and Rural Development that I would like to share is that
During COVID time, we actually found the profound work done by the Gram Panchayats across the country, especially in Karnataka. And somehow in the chapter of health and nutrition, I find a passive mention only of one line of involving community and Gram Panchayats, but I think we are somehow missing that decentralization is the key to forward development. As Anil Kumar sir was rightly mentioning, in inculcating or in including more and more private individuals into the system is going to be a death knell for the entire system, because they are going to be unionized, unionization is going to be there, and more demands for regularization is going to be there. So it's, even if it is about adding additional worker in Anganwadi center, or even if it is about hiring a middle level health professional, whatever may be, adding on to HR is going to be a problem in the long run for the government, because of the financing and the entire sustenance part of it. So there the relevance of involving more and more Gram Panchayats will come into play, because Gram Panchayats at the community level with a little amount of support from the government can create better effect on the field by taking up responsibility of running these institutions without causing additional burden in terms of HR. So, and that we have seen actually working effectively through task forces that were created in Gram Panchayats in Karnataka during COVID time, and they have done exemplary work during that time. So again, in Anganwadi centers, we have seen experiments like CMAM in Telangana, where the community has taken up the additional feeding of severely malnourished children in after the Anganwadi hours by the community, in the presence of the community, and that has led to remarkable change in the development of the child. And I think that is something which already states like Kerala have established in their kind of functioning. Health and all the education, health, Anganwadi, women and child development, all that major service delivery, field level service delivery institution management is taken over by the panchayats, and they have been proving successful. And as we know, their indicators, be it IMR or whatever be, are on par with European countries or even better than that. Now, coming to the social protection and welfare scheme chapter, I found that Singapore Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam's statement very interesting, that we have to provide social safety trampolines and the social safety nets so as to push more people to urban areas. That is the message that is being given. Whereas I have my own doubts about pushing more and more people to urban areas when we are already reeling at a lot of troubles in the urban areas. So maybe Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam's idea of Pura, providing urban amenities in rural areas may be the way ahead, and that is the direction maybe we have to, because comparing with Singapore for a country like India may be not that beneficial, because Singapore has its own reasons why Singapore is Singapore, because the kind of democracy that we enjoy in our country, or the kind of checks and balances that we have in our country may not be there in Singapore. It's almost a benevolent dictator that was there in Singapore for a long period of time, and people are in awe of their leader, and they are very compliant, and even their development style is like by reclaiming more and more land from the sea, whereas it won't be a possible solution for a country like India. So that was one observation from that chapter, but I really find your suggestion, some key recommendations from the chapter, like replacing farmer free electricity for farmer with an income structure based model is actually quite captivating our imaginations, and it has to be tried out, or it's already tried out in some parts of the country, as you have already pointed out. But who will belt the cat is the main question. So farmers have been enjoying free electricity for all these years, and they have seen it coming without any stress and any issues. And suddenly, when we make it as an income structure based, or as a payment, direct payment to their accounts, against which the electricity's dues will be cut, so that who will belt the cat, and which political party will have the courage to take such a decision, because it's all about electoral dynamics. It's all about who will win the next election, and who would want to take such, and what is the motivation or inspiration for the party, for any party for that matter, to take such a strong decision. Because there won't be a political consensus. You are also mentioning about the need of political consensus for any reform to happen and sustain in the country. So I doubt, even though it's a very good prescription, if it happens actually. Then the mention about inclusive growth dividend is actually a new concept, and I think it has been already tried out in Kenya, as you are mentioning in that IGD has proved beneficial in a particular experiment out over there. And he also goes to an extent of saying that had IGD been there, we wouldn't have seen laborers walking down the roads during COVID time. And you are mentioning that state governments have to step in to take lead to implement small pilots of IGDs because center has its own limitations. So at this point, you are also mentioning or taking examples of the guarantee programs that are happening in Karnataka, the free bus mobility and all that as examples for various leads that the state government can take. But then the question is how far the state can stretch itself. What we are seeing in Kerala, the financial crisis that the state is facing is mainly because the stress that it put on the social expenditure. And now the state is being blamed for not putting enough stress on capital expenditure. And so, who will judge, who will be the judge? Who will judge which was the right stand? Now that they have progressed a lot in the health and women and child sector because of the overstress in the social expenditure, but on the other hand, they are suffering because of the financial crisis. So states will have their own reservations, maybe, in while taking up such leads. And one more observation that I would like to mention is that overharping on technological solutions may not be the right way, because all said and done, having public disclosure of the facilities and of the public goods over a portal or over an app may sound very captivating or may sound very efficient. But then when we think about the last person in that last village, how she is disconnected from the digital world around her, may be a question that may have to force all of us to think again and again about harping on the technological solutions more. So again, I will come back to my initial point that involving Gram Panchayats will and only be the way ahead to ensure that exclusion at that last mile, or as Uma Mahadevan ma'am would like to mention, as the first mile of development, will be the game changer in the field of development in coming days. And yeah, so other than that, that 2x2 framework that you have mentioned about evaluating any scheme rather than branding any scheme outright as a freebie or as a waste of public money, that's a new trend. As soon as the government announces any program of giving welfare act, especially welfare program, social welfare program, there are a group of people who will be jumping and commenting it as a freebie or as a populist measure. But Professor Karthik is very right in saying that we should always judge the scheme by its efficiency as well as equity trade-off, and not categorize it blindly as a freebie or as a populist measure. Overall, a very interesting read, light read, though the size of the book may be intimidating. I request all of you to read it for a wonderful journey through the world of data driven decision making and how it can impact the development of our country. Thank you.
I just want to make one quick response. I think, a lot of those issues are there in chapter 8, so it highlights the perils of just reading one chapter. So I think part of the reason it is big is because each of these issues are there. But I agree completely. And in fact, I think it's interesting when we talk about personnel, right? The most frustrating thing in personnel every single time.
So what we will do now, sir? Vijay Bhaskar, sir?
Yes.
What we will do now, sir?
You have to talk on.
Sir, I will do it.
After that, we have a public,
No, that's what, sir. I will do with Mr. Karthik separately, sir. Fine, Mr.
I'll just complete one.
For the benefit of the audience also, you'll have to speak on data.
Yeah. I'll just complete one sentence. No,
Finance also, because you're also in finance.
Yeah, that's right. Two key departments. Yeah. No, I think, but what I wanted to say was that there's this key challenge of recruitment, that we don't have enough staff, but we are scared of recruitment because of kind of accountability. So using local bodies for that becomes a really, really important trend. So can I complete it? So it's there in that chapter.
Okay, I had to speak on data. Only three things. What gets measured can be bettered first. Second, data has three characteristics: validity, accuracy, and the context in which it has to be interpreted. So if we get this thing right, it becomes effective. In government, many times we do not use data to predict, but we can use data to prioritize. For example, Riju and Jafar were responsible for SATS database. When we had to build classrooms, we used SATS database to at least put 50 to 70% of the classrooms in place where they were required, rather than otherwise. Otherwise, it would have been more discretionary. So in government, we usually use statistics. Subsequently, if it's possible to use it prior, it actually adds more value. So I'll not talk more than that. I have a lot more to do with Professor Karthik. Vijay Bhaskar sir has been telling, we have had the opportunity to work with him, under him for almost 2 decades. So a lot of things used to take us. In fact, when we do, as planning secretary, I do the KDP. A lot of things I follow what you used to do, sir, line by line. It hurts people, but it's effective. So, and not more to say. With your permission, sir, what I will do now is I'll ask for 4 or 5 questions to be done. Professor Karthik, you take everything at once. You have a few questions asked by the speakers also. Everything you can respond at once. So that will have. You have almost 2 hours into this one. So can I have the first question from, and we'll have a gender balance on this. Okay? Okay. Mr. Janaki Ram. Mr. Janaki Ram happens to be the Joint Director in the Department of Economics and Statistics, looking after SDG goals.
Thank you, sir. Sir, a very wonderful presentation, sir. I'm touching on the chapter 6, sir. In the chapter 6, sir, for 3 principles for effective spending, you said that prioritizing cost effectiveness, improving and rewarding performance, and post-contract management and accountability. In addition to that, what I feel is convergence of schemes may also be required, sir, because there are multiple schemes which will be implemented by different departments. So if you see convergence of schemes, it is also one of the things which is required. Thank you, sir.
That's what this mandate is. Tulsi, can we have something from you?
So I am.
Please give the mic to madam.
Good evening, Professor. This graph which you have showed for the Rajasthan schools where the grade of enrollment and the level of learning, what was the intervention you suggested for them? Because Kaveri must be knowing, and this is what I observe when I go to the schools in the rural areas also. The first bench kids will learn the class text. The last bench kids are, I feel pity for them, and sometimes I feel it would have been better if we let them do their work with their parents. Because they come here to eat food, but then the schools are not feeding centers. We were supposed to teach them, and they miss the bus somewhere in the up to class 3, 4. They are not able to catch. So what is the intervention you suggest there?
Okay. Pawan, would you like to ask anything?
How to read the booklet, sir, but having gone through the address, sir. On the schools thing, just wanted to the developed countries. What is that we are aspiring to be? I mean, now the question is that kids who have completed schooling are unable to read and write. Is this the same across? Question number 1. Second thing is, now, is there not natural selection where few kids perform well, few don't, and the job market appropriately takes care of all sectors? Happens across the world, even in developed countries. Otherwise, we'll create a problem of plenty. Now everybody gets educated very well. Where are the jobs going to come from? Or because sir was saying in case of police department, even in constabulary, very highly educated people have home place. How are we going to address that? So, I mean, just a thought, not a question as such.
Okay. From FPI, Professor Narayana, would you like to ask anything, please? Professor Narayana from retired from ISEC. He's with FPI. Professor Narayana.
I have 2 observations. The first one is the latest UN population projections for India, as in the past, have shown that India will continue to have the highest share of working age population, but at the same time, the share of the child population as well as that of the youth population are going to continuously decline, and that of elderly population is going to have a phenomenal rise. Now, I just want to get your reaction. How consistent your suggestions of accelerating India's development in the context of this age structure transition now and in future? One. Second one is the early childhood education, you made a mention about that. How early should we intervene in the policy as far as this sector of childhood development is concerned? I remember there was a classic Heckman's curve which emphasized on investing from age 0, not necessarily to wait age 3 or even age 6. I would like to know whether you have, because you have done some work in the area of ICDS program, any evidence either confronting or supporting for that celebrated Heckman's curve? Thank you.
Any last question here from one of the lady attendees? Anybody? I'll just finish and come to you. So nobody there, I'll come to you. Madam, after that, I'll come to you, sir.
Professor Karthik, there is a lot of mention about quality of funding which needs to change versus the quantity. How do you assess when you say quality of funding? Like, what are the metrics which we are looking into?
Yeah, but the gentleman here. This would be the mics, sir. Mics.
Good afternoon to everybody, sir. I myself, Dr. B.S. Gulsetti, professor, retired, and the Indian Institute of Public Administration, New Delhi, and regional branch, Bangalore, local branch, Gulbarga. I am the honorary secretary. On their invitation, I have attending all these things, and we too also having a planning to organize such types of system along with our professor Karthik ji and other so many.
Do you have any questions, sir?
Yes, just this. So only thing is I did my PhD on the impact of economic development on social structure of Indian village. So that shows the only thing is that India is based on the rural life. And there we have to be more concentrated because now it is the population of Indian rural population is 68%. That is why we have, I feel as a scholar, as a academicians, so we have to be given the more importance for the rural area. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Sir, I think you should respond to all of them, sir. Followed after you go this one, Professor Vijay Bhaskar, Mr. Vijay Bhaskar.
So first of all, let me just thank all the panelists. I know some of you had very short time and notice, for reading and commenting. So I think, see, this is really meant to be a conversation starter, right? And in the end, like I was telling Mr. Vijay Bhaskar, see, people who are in the government, those of you who are in the government, I think you will have the best judgment of what is at the intersection of important and feasible, and therefore worth investing time in. Right? So, and I think that's kind of, one of the key areas where the way the book is written, at one level, it feels like it has too many ideas, but it's because it's a menu. So the idea is to provide a menu that different officers, different states will be able to take up. And so that way, because as a country, we need more policy experimentation, but you need to de-risk that process. And so if you try to do reforms at nationwide, some of our most successful interventions nationwide have emerged from state level pilots, right? So Enrega came from Maharashtra, Asha workers came from the work in Gadchiroli by Dr. Abhay Bang and Rani Bang. So midday meals came from Tamil Nadu. So, or now PM Kisan came from Raitu Bandhu and Kalia, so there have been, in almost every case, major nationwide interventions have kind of been piloted and refined at the state level. So there's a lot more room for state-led action to actually drive both state and national development. So I think that's one of the key goals. And particularly happy to have had this forum in this format. I think, the discussions on personnel, the discussions on data, the discussions on health, and there's content everywhere, right? And I think, like I said, and I think there was a very appropriate comment about the variation across Indian states and how difficult even that is, which is why I think the chapter 8 on federalism and decentralization is one of these really critical cross-cutting chapters. And Karnataka has actually done more on that. So there may be areas even there where Karnataka can lead because there's a certain kind of political history that supported that decentralization. So I think I won't react to more kind of comments from the panelists. We'll take it offline on specific ideas, but there's a lot to, lot to unpack. So I think, so convergence goes without saying, right? And that applies in many. So I talk about that particularly in the jobs chapter, because the jobs chapter in some ways is the hardest chapter to write, because it is like writing all of economics in one chapter, right? Because it's not one department. It really is about the different actions that the government does and how they all connect. So the convergence, and I discussed that to some extent in nutrition, but absolutely. I think the question you asked, so there are multiple questions on education. Okay, so what is the intervention? How do you address that challenge? And the truth is, this is one of the hardest problems in education around the world. Okay, so I think, and like the gentleman behind was saying, what happens in other countries? I think there is, if you look at the data, I suspect that there are many high schools in the US, okay, where children are completing high school without being able to read. And partly, again, because you have this general kind of sense of saying, okay, we have compulsory schooling and children are going to stay in school for the sake of being in school, but they're not actually learning. Okay, so let me give two responses. So the first, in a world, because in a way you're pushing in different directions, right? Because your question was, how do you improve this? Your question was, should you even want to improve it? I mean, given what that implications are, okay? Now, let's assume for a moment we are in a sane world and we want to improve it, okay? So I think the first point of shedding light on that data is to say how something like RTE, which was very well intentioned, and we have a no detention policy, how that kind of creates these perversities in the classroom. That the reason you have that variation is the child has gone from class 2 to class 8 without actually passing class 2, and you're kind of routinely doing it. Okay, so one part is just to shed light on reality so that we understand and kind of act accordingly. So in terms of what are the interventions, I would say, so obviously in primary school, there is a lot of work on foundational literacy and numeracy and the centrality of being able to make sure that every child can read. And that's why I keep saying, you need to read to learn to be able to learn to read. Okay, sorry, learn to read to be able to read to learn. And that has to happen by class 3. Now again, the national policy documents are always excellent, right? So Land Pritchett has this wonderful description of India as a flailing state, right? So the failing state can't function. The flailing state has a brilliant head, but is disconnected from the limbs, okay? So the brilliant head makes incredible policy. So the NEP is a beautiful document, but I was also part of the 12th plan process, and we wrote in that plan when I was working with Dr. Monte Caluvalia about the centrality of universal foundation literacy. So that was there, and NEP, I submitted the same comments, it's there. Now the good news is we have Nippon, we have some of these schemes, but what we don't have is still accountability for the outcomes. Okay, so so I think there's more to be done on implementation of foundational literacy numeracy, and which is why, again, that independent data measurement, if you have that every single year, that becomes a force multiplier for all of government, right? So coming back to the comment from the police department, see, one of the hardest problems of policing is because there is this huge bias in reporting, okay, that sometimes when you improve policing, crime will go up, okay, because more people feel comfortable reporting the crime. So the places with the lowest reported crime rates may actually have the highest crime. So that is such a wicked problem. So to even have a credible measure of safety, you need something that is independent of the reporting bias, okay. So these kind of investments then allow us to really understand what's going on, okay. So then to answer your question about the interventions, so the one thing that seems to have worked meaningfully is kind of personalized computerized education, like where you're able to customize the instruction. But even there, a lot more details are needed. See, because what government does for EdTech is think of it as procuring computers. Okay, but that has zero impact. So, but if you do the EdTech well, so in fact in Mindspark, which is a company based out of Bangalore, the beauty of EdTech, if you do it well. So what does all the research show? It is not that inputs are useless, but inputs are not sufficient because the binding constraint is governance and pedagogy, right? So there's pedagogy. Are you teaching at the right level to the right kid? And what the computerized personalized learning allows us to do is tailor the content to every single kid. So then in that intervention, even though you are all in 8th class, every child is getting kind of personalized tailored content. And the beauty is we have visibility on usage. So you can see what is happening every single day. And that is something that I'm quite, optimistic about, but a lot more work has to happen. So I think your question is a very interesting one, right? And I think the nature of the Indian education system itself. So when I present in the US and I talk about the challenges of Indian education, everybody is very surprised. They say, we thought you had the best education system in the world. You have the CEO of Microsoft, CEO of Google, CEO of IBM, CEO of FedEx. They'll basically say you guys are taking over the world. Okay, so we thought you had the best education system. Okay, but what that doesn't capture is that what India has is not a great education system. What we have is a fantastic filtration system. Okay, so you have these high stakes exams, and the children who are going to pass that, the top 0.01% of a billion-person distribution is going to do outstanding things, regardless of whether you teach them. Okay, so what you're seeing in the US is kind of that selection, right? It is not the value addition of the system; it is the selection system. So the part where the system works is in selection. So the challenge is not that everybody should kind of become, the top, but the problem is because we are a selection-based system, if the child is not at the top, we kind of completely abandon them. So the point is to move from a selection paradigm to a developmental paradigm where you are focused on, do I know more than I did yesterday? Okay. So if you think about a skilling problem, a jobs problem, you've got this crazy situation where employers, Larsen Tubro says, I can't find enough engineers, I can't take contracts because I don't have skilled people. And then you have lakhs of educated unemployed youth. So what is going on? It's because we have produced an education system that has degrees and not skills. Okay, so it is not about saying where are the fancy jobs? No, there are jobs. We don't have people to fill them, and that's because the system is producing degrees without skills and understanding. Okay, so that's the system, that's the change we need, focusing on a developmental paradigm and not a selection paradigm. Okay, so that's, I think, a key point. And then, yes, the age structure and how early would you intervene. So I think, see, there is a reason the book is called Accelerating India's Development. I don't get into the business of projecting, are we going to be 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%, okay? Because that is going to depend on a whole bunch of structural factors, right? Some of it is going to be our age structure, which we can't do anything about. Some of it is going to be global factors. A pandemic might happen, war might happen. We can't control those things, okay? But my point is that there are still enough actions that we have that regardless of what the structural growth rate might be, we can do 2% more, 3% more if we manage to fix the effectiveness of the system. So that's why I'm not predicting a rate, but I'm saying whatever that rate might be, we can do better. Okay, like if you act on this. I think the subtle point then you raise about what is the right age to intervene. So I agree it's a bit of a double-edged sword, okay, because there is a risk that when you do early childhood education, everybody says, I'm going to now make you learn ABC at 2, okay, or ABC at 3, because that's kind of the pressure to kind of teach content. But what the research says is that early childhood development is not the same as early childhood kind of cramming, okay? But a lot of this is about play-based learning, about socio-emotional skills, about kind of word. So what Heckman will say is that high income, high socio-economic status kids, they listen, they are exposed to so many more words, they're exposed to so many more books. So when we say early intervention, a big part of this is not saying, hey, I'm going to make you sit in front of a board and learn ABC at age 2 or 3. A lot of it is also about kind of parental and maternal education, like that says, how do you kind of engage with your children in a way that brings kind of more kind of words and cognitive content. So it's more about kind of the plasticity of the brain and what it is exposed to. And again, we have these traditions in our own kind of, in our own mythology of Ashwatthama learning in the womb, right? Like, so it is the idea that the brain absorbs, even though it can't express, is a very, very powerful one, right? So it doesn't have to be that you have to learn to recite ABC. It is how, but are you being exposed? And there's a lot of research. I think the problem in the early childhood research, kind of translation of research to policy, is most of the research is done in very small scale studies, okay? And very, very small scale and without following up over time. Okay, so the challenge is, and why do I keep going back to the Anganwadi worker? And one point I want to come back to is I think multiple people raise this concern about the stress of regularization with some of these ideas, right? And see, the fundamental chicken and egg problem we have in government today is we are ridiculously understaffed. Okay, but we are too scared to hire. We're scared to hire because that once you hire, you can't get the accountability. Okay, so, but how are you going to allow the state to wither away because you're so scared of hiring? Okay, so, which is why we have to get kind of creative, right? So what Telangana did, which was this very interesting pilot, they appointed, because the problem is you need staff, but you need accountability. So they hired 10,000 new panchayat secretaries and said that you measure your performance over 3 and 4 years and only regularize on the basis of that. And, and it worked. I mean, and it's not an accident that Telangana won 40% of National Panchayat Raj awards, even though they're only like 5%, because the staff mattered. Those 10,000 people mattered, but they were hired with accountability. So, and this is why changing the culture at the time of recruitment becomes so important, because that same commissioner in PRRD, Panchayati Raj, when he went to agriculture, because CGS was supporting the performance measurement, he said, this is great, please bring it to agriculture. But there it didn't work as well, because what he said was in agriculture, the employees had been hired and had been there for 15 years. So they're already used to a system where if you now try to do performance measurement, it doesn't work. But if from day one, there is kind of an expectation that when you're hired, it's going to be built in, then the acceptability is much higher. So that's why you need system level thinking and not kind of ad hoc interventions. And the personnel piece in particular needs kind of, you have to thread it through judicial factors, political factors, administrative factors, financial factors. And that's why every secretary over the years, in the past 15 years, will say, yes, personnel is important, but it's too difficult for me to take on because it is too complicated and therefore requires kind of coordinated action. And that's part of the goal of putting something like this together. So I'll just stop there.
I would request Vijay Bhaskar sir to
Sir Karthik Muralidharan, my dear former colleagues in the government of Karnataka, and dear participants, online and here personally present here. It's been a great experience to have listened to Professor Karthik Muralidharan, and we have all been captivated by his enormous knowledge and the way he has woven all these different strands of knowledge into a coherent and a focused sort of a message. And the message that he has given in his book is that you don't have to spend more, because you need to spend more, as Mr. Anil Kumar pointed out, in education or in health or in education. But you also can improve the effectiveness of what you are spending. And that is what he has tried to do in this talk and in his book. And in his book, if you go through the book, I mean, you not feel very intimidated by the size of the book. There are about 812 pages in the book. But 212 pages are notes and bibliography and references and knowledge. So it shows the depth of research that has gone into the writing of this book. So it is not a book, I mean, we also, most of us have our own experience. Based on our experience, as he says in the book, most bureaucrats, we work on basis of experience, intuition, common sense, or field observation, or suggestions that come up from below. But very few of us have the benefit of getting information based on evidence-based ideas. And the great contribution that Professor Karthik Muralidharan has made to development is that he has brought together thousands of studies, research studies, evidence to form a coherent and a focused, give a focused message. And this message, because he has applied it to different sectors also to give reform ideas for each sector. So this is the main the lesson that we can all get from this talk. Michael Barber, who was an advisor to many British prime ministers, he has said that policy is only 10%.
implementation is other details.
But implementation is 90%. We all have also heard that what Thomas Alva Edison said, inspiration is 1%, perspiration is 99%. So ideas are there which have been given in his book, but implementation of these ideas is what is important. And implementation requires a further detailing, further knowledge, and further, of course, innovation, experimentation, and piloting if necessary, scaling up. But nowadays, scaling up also need not be done. And he is, of course, he has throughout his book, I find that there are two basic messages that we can find: use of data and use of technology. And I'm sure that all of us here, based on my experience, we can say that government can do a lot more to use data. We are using technology to some extent now. We have all heard about Karnataka's guarantees, and we could reach out to more than 1 crore beneficiaries thanks to the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and the mobile, and our own Kutumba family database that we have created. So thanks to our family database that we had, we could reach out to more than 1 crore beneficiaries within the span of a few months without any So direct benefit transfer was possible. So technology, we have made some advances, but there is much more that can be done. And but data is something that I'm based on my own experience, and I'm sure all of us agree that we can do much more. And that is where the role of the planning and statistics department, which Dr. Vishal heads, is very important. And the ideas on data and on which and statistics which have been made, which have been given in the book, are core and fundamental to our functioning. Evidence-based functioning requires data, and this is where we differ from the private sector. The private sector bases its decisions on evidence, but we, government, most of us work on basis of hunches, intuition, prior knowledge or experience, suggestions. So I think these core messages, one is data, other is technology. I think with all of this we can implement, we can spend money on this. And what he has mentioned in his book is, if we spend a few percentage of our budget, it's probably 0.1% of our budget on data, because we are spending on technology, thanks to we have a e-governance department. But on data and more on technology, the effectiveness of the Indian state would improve. Effectiveness of all our programs, projects, schemes would improve. That is the core message that I have got from reading this. Because I have to confess, I have not read the full book, I have read half the book. But in half the book, that is the core message, data and technology. Using data and technology, it doesn't cost much. You don't have to spend 10,000 crores or 5,000 crores. So you can need to spend probably a few hundred crores. And with that, you can get the data and the technology to make our projects and our governance more effective. And I'm sure the passion and the knowledge that with which Professor Karthik Muralidharan has spoken has had a deep impact on all of us. And I am really grateful that we have had such a illustrious panel of discussants. And I personally grateful to all of them for being present here. They are very busy people, very busy people. And they have taken time out of their extremely busy routines to come here and listen to the lecture and to give they have gone through the relevant chapters, many of them, and they have given their opinion on these chapters. I'm really grateful to all of them. And this is a IIPA, I think, likes to see itself as a bridge between the practitioners and the theoreticians or the academicians. And here we have on stage, we have a theoretician or academician who is, based on his research studies, he has come out with ideas, and we have practitioners who have absorbed these ideas and have responded to them. I'm sure all of them will take home a few lessons and try to implement them in their own offices, in their own departments from tomorrow or today. I am confident that they are all a few of the suggestions that have been made, ideas that have been made by Professor Karthik Muralidharan will be implemented, because we have people who are implementing the ideas on stage. I'm thankful to them. I'm thankful to all of the audience also for being present, and also the online and the offline audience. So with these words, I will now invite summing up, and we will end with the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for the presidential address. On behalf of the IIPA and the Administrative Research Institute, I would request Vijay Bhaskar sir to give a small memento to Professor Karthik. I hope it is not his own book. I just want to the government, you never know, you never know, you never know. Okay, that's slightly bigger. Okay, I also request Vijay Bhaskar sir to give as a memento a copy of the book. This is compulsory for all the panelists. Next week we have a question and answer session. It goes into your CR. It goes into your CR.
Give a question.
Question paper. That's what I said. You and I can do the UR and planning, we can do anything. ಅದು ಬೇರೆ ತಂದು ಕೊಡಿ. ಪುಸ್ತಕ ತಂದು ಕೊಡಿ.
This will really be a fascinating book program.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Very
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm the one who's read it twice, sir. I've read it twice. Twice I've already read it. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. On behalf of the IIPA and the Office Officers Association, I thank Professor Karthik for the fantastic talk. Thank you very much, Professor Karthik, for joining us here. I also thank Mr. Vijay Bhaskar, sir, for organizing this as diligent as they come. Source of inspiration, sir. Thank you very much for being here. I also thank my co-panelists, the officers in the audience, the various members of the audience, distinguished guests. Thank you very much for coming here. There's high tea outside. Please join us.
Thank you.